Hello friends, welcome back. Picture this. Deep in the cave systems of South Africa, buried under hundreds of feet of rock, in a chamber so narrow and so difficult to reach that even trained spelunkers have to squeeze through a crack, barely 8 inches wide. Scientists find bones, hundreds of them, thousands actually, the remains of at least 15 individuals stacked in a space that has no obvious way in and no obvious way out. No predator drag marks, no flood deposits to explain how they got there. No signs of a catastrophic accident, just bones quietly waiting in the dark for nearly 300,000 years. Now, here is the question that will follow you through this entire video. What if the creatures who carried those bodies into that cave were not human? Not in the way we define it. Not begrained. Not language-using. Not technologically sophisticated by any standard we would normally recognize. What if they had brains roughly the size of an orange, smaller than a chimpanzee, with heads and shoulders that looked almost ape-like, but hands and feet that looked startlingly like yours? What if a small, reined hominin, one that most scientists had never seriously considered capable of symbolic thought, was intentionally treating its dead like people do? That is not a hypothetical. That is the claim sitting at the center of one of the most contested, most talked about, and most genuinely strange paleoanthropological debates of the last decade. And depending on who you ask, it either rewrites everything we thought we knew about the origins of ritual and cognition, or it is a dramatic overreach built on incomplete evidence and wishful thinking. Here is the tension that makes this story so hard to put down. When the headlines hit, and they hit hard, they said things like, "Ancient human relative buried its dead." Social media ran with it. The narrative was clean and compelling, a primitive cousin of ours shuffling through fire-lit darkness, lowering its dead into a sacred underground chamber. Beautiful, cinematic, probably a little too clean, because what the actual evidence shows, and more importantly, what it cannot show, is considerably messier. The bones are real. The cave is real. The difficulty of reaching that chamber is absolutely real. But whether what happened there constitutes burial, ritual, or something else entirely, something we may not even have a word for yet, that is where the science gets genuinely complicated, genuinely fascinating, and genuinely unresolved. We are going to go through all of it, the discovery and the team that made it, because that story alone reads like science fiction. The anatomy of the creature itself, Homo Naledi, which is a mosaic of features so contradictory that researchers initially could not agree on where to place it in the human family tree. The dating, which when it finally came through, genuinely shocked the field. The specific arguments for deliberate body disposal, and why some of the most respected names in paleoanthropology pushed back hard. The fire evidence, the sediment evidence, the bone surface marks, and what each of them can and cannot tell us. And finally, if Naledi did do something intentional with its dead, what that would actually mean for how we think about cognition, culture, and what makes us human. By the way, if you're listening to this on Spotify, you already know the deal. No ads, no background music, just the story. If you're not, there is a link in the description to follow there. It is genuinely the best way to support this kind of work, and I would really appreciate it. Before we go any further, drop a comment right now and tell me where you are and what time it is. I check every single one. Last time there were people in Tokyo eating breakfast, people in Sao Paulo just getting off a night shift, people in Dublin who should absolutely have been asleep. It is one of my favorite things about making these. Somehow, a 300,000-year-old mystery is keeping people awake from Berlin to Brisbane at the same moment, and that never gets old. All right, here is where we start. Not with the bones, not yet. We start with the cave, because until you understand just how impossible it is to reach that chamber, none of the rest of this makes sense. A deep, narrow, pitch-black labyrinth in the hills outside Johannesburg, where a couple of cavers, following a lead that most people would have ignored, stumbled onto something that nobody was prepared for. The year was 2013, and what they found was about to make headlines around the world: the cradle of humankind. That is what they call the region northwest of Johannesburg, a stretch of dolomitic limestone, hills that has been producing hominin fossils for nearly a century. Mrs. Please, Littlefoot, the town child. The bones come up here with a frequency that almost seems deliberate, like the ground itself has something to say. Rising Star Cave System sits right in the middle of it, about 50 kilometers from the city, inside a UNESCO World Heritage Site that most tourists visit for the surface museum and then leave without ever really understanding what is happening underneath their feet. The cave system is not small. It extends for roughly 3 kilometers of mapped passages, a maze of dolomite corridors, chambers, and crawlways carved by water over millions of years. Cavers had been working Rising Star for decades. It was a known system, reasonably well explored, not considered especially mysterious. And then in 2013, two recreational cavers named Stephen Tucker and Rick Hunter decided to push a section of passage that most people had looked at, noted the difficulty, and turned back from. The section is called the Superman Crawl, which tells you everything you need to know about how you have to move through it. Flat on your stomach, arms extended, face inches from the rock for roughly 30 meters. On the other side, a series of descents and climbs through increasingly tight passages until you reach what explorers call the Dragon's Back, a steep, narrow ridge of rock that you have to scramble over at a height that would make most people reconsider their life choices. And then at the bottom there is a vertical chute, roughly 12 meters down, with walls close enough on either side that your body fills most of the available space. At its narrowest, that chute is about 18 centimeters wide, roughly 7 or 8 inches, the width of a standard sheet of paper with a little room to spare. Tucker and Hunter made it through, and at the bottom, in a chamber that had almost certainly not been visited by any modern human before them, they found a floor scattered with bones, hominin bones, the kind you recognize even without training, because they look unmistakably like us. They photographed what they could, got out and contacted Lee Bergerer, a paleoanthropologist at the University of the Witwatersrand, who had already made a name for himself with a previous discovery in the same region, Oralopithecus sediba, in 2008. Berger looked at the photographs and understood immediately that this was something significant. The anatomy was unfamiliar, the quantity was staggering, and the location created a logistical problem. Unlike anything the field had encountered before, normal excavation teams cannot fit through that chute, not most of them anyway. Berger's response was to put out an open call for researchers with the right combination of skills, specifically paleoanthropologists and scientists, with caving experience and specifically with a body profile that could physically make it through the passage. The call went out in late 2013 and went genuinely viral, which was unusual for academic recruitment. Within days, hundreds of applications had come in from researchers around the world. Berger selected a team of 6, all women, all with the combination of scientific training and physical capability the job required. They were called the underground astronauts, and the name stuck, partly because it captured something real about the nature of what they were doing. They were working in an environment as isolated and hostile to human presence as anything short of actual orbit. The excavation that followed was unlike anything in the history of the discipline. The scientists worked in conditions that required hours of physical effort just to reach the site and hours more to get out, with no guarantee that any given day's transit would be smooth. Equipment had to be designed specifically for the chamber. Communication happened through a relay of people stationed at different points in the passage. A surface team monitored everything via cameras and provided real-time support. It was a logistical operation that had more in common with a deep-sea research mission than a traditional fossil dig. Now, here is what the cave context actually tells us, independent of the bones themselves. The chamber at the bottom of that chute, which the team named the Denality chamber after the Siso word for stars, is not connected to any other part of the cave system by a route that is easy, accidental, or passable by most large animals. The Doomite geology means there are no ancient river channels that could have washed material into that space. There are no ceiling collapses that would have deposited bones from above. The sediment analysis showed no evidence of a debris flow. The chamber was in all the ways that matter a closed system. Things that ended up on that floor got there because something or someone brought them there, through that chute or through a passage that may have since closed. That distinction between passive deposition and active transport became the central question of the entire debate. But the cave's geology was already making passive explanations harder to sustain before anyone had a fully formed hypothesis. What was immediately obvious when the team began processing the material, sorting, cataloging, photographing the thousands of fragments that came up from the Denali chamber was that they were looking at many different individuals. Not a single body, not a family unit killed in one event, but a minimum count that kept rising as analysis continued. At least 15 individuals across the initial excavation, different ages, different sexes, different stages of development, infants, juveniles, adults, the aged. What was not immediately obvious was how they got there, why there were so many, or what the creature actually was. The anatomy was strange enough that initial classification took significant time and debate. Some features looked ancient, almost Australopithecine. Others looked surprisingly modern. The combination did not fit cleanly anywhere in the existing family tree. The world found out about all of this in September 2015, when Berger and his colleagues published in the journal EIFE and held a press conference that was streamed internationally. The discovery had been kept under tight embargo, which only increased the momentum when the news finally broke. Within hours, it was everywhere. The creature had a name, Homo Naledi, meaning star in Sesotho, a nod to the chamber that had held it in darkness for reasons nobody yet understood. And that is exactly where the science stopped being straightforward, because naming the creature was the easy part. What came next was a fight about what kind of mind could have been responsible for what that chamber contained. When the first skeletons were reconstructed well enough to get a full-body sense of this thing, one reaction kept coming up from researchers who knew the hominin record inside and out. It shouldn't look like this. Homoni became an instant textbook example of something called mosaic evolution. That just means evolution doesn't remodel the whole body at once. It tinkers. It upgrades one system, leaves another mostly alone, and sometimes even keeps very old solutions running right next to brand new ones. You don't get a smooth gradient from primitive ape to modern human. You get bodies that look like they were assembled from parts, with very different evolutionary ages. Naledi is that idea made flesh. Start with the single feature that caused most of the controversy, the brain. The endocranial volume of Homo Naledi is tiny by Homo standards. The estimates cluster around 465 to 610 centimeters. That puts it closer to Australopithecus and even large chimpanzees than to us. Modern humans average around 1,300 to 1,400 centimeters. Neanderthals are in the same ballpark or a bit higher. Even earlier members of our genus, like Homo erectus, generally have much larger brains than Naledi. So on brain size alone, if you'd seen just the skull cap lying on a table, you might have guessed you were looking at something 2 million years old, somewhere around the cus, or an early cus, Homo transitional form. But then you look down the rest of the skeleton. The teeth and jaws, for instance, don't match some ultra-primitive ape-man. Naledi's teeth are relatively small and simple compared to robust Australopithecines, and the jaw lacks the huge chewing adaptations you see in those earlier forms. The face is tucked in, not dramatically projecting forward, like a chimp or a very early hominin. The skull overall has a mix of ancient and derived traits, but it doesn't scream bush ape. There are hints of something more streamlined, more human-like, hiding behind that small brain case. And then you go farther down. The hands became one of the first anatomical shockers. Naledi's fingers are curved, strongly curved in a way that looks right at home in a climbing branch grasping primate. That curvature suggests the hand experienced regular loading in flexed positions, the kind of mechanical stress you'd get from climbing or scrambling in complex three-dimensional environments. Very Australopithecine vibes, but attached to those curved fingers is a wrist and palm that look alarmingly modern. The wrist bones are reconfigured in ways we associate with precision grip and forceful manipulation. The thumb is long and robust relative to the fingers, a key ingredient in the kind of power and precision grips you need for making and using tools. Some of the fine details of the hand actually look more derived, more advanced than what you see in earlier Homo erectus. Imagine that for a moment. A hand that looks built both for climbing and for careful, forceful manipulation. A hand that could plausibly move around in trees and also strike flakes off a stone core, or hold a tail, with considerable control. Move down to the feet, and the mosaic continues. Ni had feet that at a glance could almost be mistaken for modern human feet. The overall structure, heel, arch, toe alignment, looks remarkably similar to ours. There's evidence for a well-formed longitudinal arch, which matters because that arch is what lets us walk and run efficiently over long distances without shredding our joints. The big toe is aligned with the others, not spread out like in apes that rely heavily on grasping branches with their feet. In other words, this was a biped, not some half-committed walker that still spent most of its merians diacal walking or hanging from trees. The lower limb anatomy supports habitual upright walking and possibly endurance walking, or running across the landscape in a way that's very familiar from later Homo. This is part of what made Na such a headache for people who tried to slot it neatly into the timeline. Tiny brain that looks half a world away from us, in cognitive capacity, attached to feet that look like they belong on a small modern human. That shouldn't happen if you imagine evolution as a straight ladder where the brain gets big first, and then everything else follows. But evolution doesn't care about our ladders. Then there are the hips and trunk. Nalad's pelvis does not look like a miniature Homo sapiens pelvis. In a lot of respects, it looks more primitive, more like the wide, flared pelvis of the signs. The iliac blades stick out to the sides rather than wrapping around in the tighter configuration you see in modern humans. The whole thing suggests a trunk that might have been shaped a bit differently with musculature that could support both bipedal walking and some degree of climbing or scrambling. The rib cage seems to flare out more than ours does, again echoing earlier homins. Combined with that small skull, Naledi ends up with a body plan that's strangely top and middle heavy in terms of primitive traits. Sitting on a lower limb package that screams long-distance lengths biped, the shoulders add another layer. Nalad's shoulder girdle is oriented more upwards than in modern humans, a posture that's more similar to apes and early homins. That upward-oriented shoulder is useful for climbing, for hoisting your body weight up, for moving in vertical environments. The clavicles and scapula fit a creature still very much at home, pulling itself up and over, not just walking on flat savanna. So, put this together, you have a small, ape-sized brain, a face and dentition that look more Homo than Australopithecus, hands with primitive curved fingers, but modern-looking wrists and thumbs, designed for manipulation, feet and ankles that are almost boringly human in their bipedal efficiency, hips, rib cage, and shoulders that look like they belong on something older and more arboreal. That is mosaic evolution in real time, different parts of the body marching to different evolutionary drums. And any time you see anatomy like this, the temptation is immediate. Read behavior straight off the bones. Curved fingers. They must have been expert climbers. Precision grip thumbs and human-like wrists. They must have been skilled tool makers. Human-like feet. They must have ranged widely. Maybe hunted, maybe carried loads over distance. A small brain, well, that seems to put a ceiling on how complex their social lives and culture could have been. These inferences aren't random. They're built on decades of comparative work across living primates and fossil homins. We know that certain joint angles and bone shapes correlate with certain movement patterns. We know that certain hand configurations make certain grips mechanically possible or impossible. Anatomy absolutely constrains behavior. A chimp can't throw a javelin the way a human can, just as a human can't brachiate through trees like a gibbon. But there's a hard limit baked into that entire approach. Bones tell you what was physically possible and what was likely, not what actually happened in the full richness of daily life. A Naledi hand could make and use tools. That doesn't mean it did so in the ways we're imagining. A small brain volume suggests certain cognitive limits, but it doesn't hand us a precise IQ score or a detailed mental life. Brain shape, organization, and wiring matter, and those are much harder to reconstruct than raw size. Most importantly for this story, skeletons cannot by themselves prove things like ritual, symbol use, or deliberate mortuary behavior. They can hint. They can make some scenarios more plausible than others. But if you want to claim that a small-brained hominin was doing something we have historically reserved for so-called modern minds, like intentionally disposing of its dead in a deep cave, you need evidence beyond the shape of the thumb or the angle of a shoulder blade. This is the tension that Homo Naledi dropped right into the center of paleoanthropology. The body form seems to belong to a creature that's part climber, part long-distance walker, with hands that look well-suited to complex manipulation, all wrapped around a brain that by our old rules of thumb shouldn't be plotting anything very elaborate. So the question becomes unavoidable. Does this mosaic body align with the kind of complex cultural behavior some researchers are now proposing? Is it even coherent to imagine a hominin with a brain the size of an orange navigating deep cave, systems controlling fire, and perhaps repeatedly disposing of its dead in a hidden chamber? To get anywhere near an honest answer, you have to step away from the skeleton for a moment and look at what was actually found with those bones. How often, in what condition, and in what kind of geological context? That's where we go next. When the first detailed papers on Rising Star came out, one number jumped off the page and slapped a lot of people awake. 15. At least 15 different individuals, all from a single chamber system, in a single cave, from a single species. That alone would make Rising Star unusual. Most hominin sites give you fragments, a jaw here, a femur there, a handful of teeth, maybe a partial skeleton, if you're very lucky, and prepared to sacrifice several goats to the taphonomic gods. Here, instead, was an assemblage so dense and so dominated by one kind of hominin that it looked less like the random scatter of prehistory and more like some kind of bone archive. And that 15 was conservative. It came from the minimum number of individuals approach. You count the most repeated element on one side of the body. If you've got, say, 15 left femurs, you've got at least 15 individuals. Later work has pushed the likely number higher as more material has come out of adjoining passages and chambers. We're probably talking about dozens of Naledi individuals represented in the wider system. But it's not just the head count, it's the representation. In that first D. Naledi chamber sample alone, researchers catalogued more than 1,500 fossil pieces, and those were only the bits big enough and intact enough to study easily. There were many more tiny fragments SD from the sediment. Taken together, they represented almost the entire skeleton replicated over and over. Skull fragments, jaws, teeth, vertebrae, ribs, shoulder blades, collarbones, long bones of the arms and legs, hand bones, foot bones, tiny bones from the inner ear. In paleoanthropology, this borders on absurd generosity. It's the difference between trying to reconstruct a book from 3 burnt pages versus finding 20 copies of the same book, all shredded, but all in the same room. You can cross-check. You can see patterns. You can be confident that you're not building a Frankenstein anatomy from unrelated individuals separated by thousands of years. And that's exactly what made the situation stranger the deeper people looked. Because when you have that much bone in one place, you can start to ask not just who is this, but what happened to them after they died. That's where toponymy comes in. Toponymy is the forensic science of what happens to remains between death and discovery. It looks at things like, are bones broken? If so, how? Fresh fractures from paramortem trauma look different from dry, ancient breaks caused by pressure or shifting sediment. Are there tooth marks from carnivores, rodent gnawing, root etching from plant activity? Are bones sorted by size or weight, as in water transport where heavier elements drop out first? Are surfaces weathered by exposure to sun and air, or do they look like they stayed in a relatively stable, protected environment? In Naledi, the broad picture that emerged was surprising. The bones are generally not heavily chewed. You don't see the classic signature of a carnivore den, puncture marks from big cats, spiral fractures caused by hyenas cracking long bones for marrow, ragged edges from repeated biting and dragging. There are no piles of mixed animal species like you'd expect if some predator was hauling kills in for years. Weathering is minimal too. The surfaces don't show the kind of bleaching, cracking, and flaking you get when bones sit out on the landscape under the African sun. They look, for the most part, like remains that went from flesh-covered to buried or otherwise protected, without a long open-air stopover. The fragmentation pattern is weird as well. Many bones are broken, but a lot of those breaks seem to be post-depositional, caused by the weight of overlying sediment, movement in the cave, or perhaps trampling by later visitors. You don't see the same systematic smashing you'd expect from hominins processing carcasses for food. And then there's the question of company. If Rising Star was just another cave that occasionally trapped animals, you'd expect a mix of species: baboons, antelope, rodents, maybe the odd carnivore, perhaps some birds or bats. Caves that act as pitfall traps or predator layers tend to be zoological junk drawers. Whatever fell in, whatever was dragged in, whatever died there over centuries in Naledi, that's not what you see. There are a few non-Naledi remains, some small rodents, a bird bone or two, the odd fragment that clearly doesn't belong to a hominin, but they are background noise. Statistically, the assemblage is overwhelmingly hominy. That dominance is one of the big red flags that something unusual is going on. If this were a natural death trap, where creatures just happen to fall in, you'd expect the opposite. Many species, few hominins. If it were a carnivore den, you'd expect a wide menu of prey species and the predator itself. If it were a fluvial deposit, you'd expect sorting by size and weight and a more diverse foral list. Instead, you have a deep, hard-to-reach chamber filled mostly with one hominin species, with minimal evidence of carnivore modification, minimal weathering, and a lot of body parts from a lot of different individuals. But Phil is doing a lot of work there, and it leads to the next question. How did this accumulation actually happen? There are two broad families of explanations. One is the single catastrophic event scenario. Imagine some horrible moment in gnarly history. A group explores the cave, gets trapped by a rockfall, runs out of light, and dies together in the dark. Or some toxic gas event sweeps through a low-lying chamber, killing everyone inside at once. That kind of scenario can, in theory, generate a lot of bodies in one place, all from roughly the same time. The other is the repeated events over time scenario. In this view, the chamber wasn't the site of one big tragedy, but many small ones. Individuals end up there on different occasions, one this year, another decades later, another centuries after that. Over thousands of years, the chamber slowly accumulates bodies. This is more like a cemetery or disposal area than a mass grave. Toponymy can sometimes help separate those possibilities. If the bones all show the same degree of mineralization, the same color, the same pattern of micro-cracking, that might suggest a relatively narrow time window. If they look like they've experienced very different histories, some more weathered, some less stained, some broken long before others, then you're looking at a longer accumulation. In Naledi, the evidence so far seems to favor a prolonged story. Different ages at death are represented: infants, juveniles, adults, old individuals, various degrees of skeletal completeness and fragmentation, layers of sediment with bones mixed in. Not one clean layer of articulated skeletons frozen in a single moment of disaster. That doesn't prove anything about intent. It doesn't automatically mean burials or ritual. Repeated natural accidents over long stretches of time could also build a layered assemblage. So could intermittent predation, if for some reason a carnivore specialized strangely in one species and left very little tooth damage. But add one more piece, and the mystery deepens. The Naledi chamber is not some wide-open cavern with a cliff edge you can accidentally stumble, and it's deep in the system, beyond multiple tight twisting passages. Getting there as a modern caver is non-trivial, even with helmets, lights, maps, and safety protocols. Yet, that is exactly where the bulk of these Nelly bones are. A deep chamber, extremely challenging to reach, dominated by the remains of one hominin. Species accumulated over time with limited evidence for the usual natural agents of bone concentration, like predators, floods, or surface exposure. That constellation of facts is what lit the fuse on the deliberate body disposal debate. Not the brain size, not the curved fingers or the human-like feet, the bones, their condition, their company, and their stubborn insistence on showing up over and over in a place that doesn't easily tolerate accidents. Before we argue about what Naledi could or could not have been thinking, we have to wrestle honestly with that pattern. What processes, natural or cultural, can move bodies into such a space more than once over extended periods? What kind of cave system are we really talking about? How is this chamber from the surface and from other potential entrances? To get there, we have to pull back from the fossils themselves and look hard at the geological stage they were resting on, and at how we know when in deep time this strange accumulation actually took place. When Rising Star was first announced, there was one crucial piece of information missing: a date. We had anatomy, we had tonomy, we had a cave map that made experienced cavers woes in sympathy. But nobody could yet say when these individuals had lived, and without a date, the mind does what it always does with mysterious hominins in caves. It punts them safely back into the deep past. A lot of early reactions basically went like this. Oh, okay. Weird, small-raned creature. Mix of primitive and modern traits. Probably some side branch from 1 million, maybe 2 million years ago, that found its way into a cave. Interesting, but not threatening to the main story. That assumption wasn't crazy. Nalad's skeleton looks, in many ways, like it belongs to an earlier chapter of human evolution. Tiny brain case, curved fingers, flared pelvis. A cocktail of traits that seemed at first glance more at home with early Homo, or even late, Australopiths, than with the sleek, tall, bee-grained humans of the last few 100,000 years. So people guessed. Some said around 2 million years, others floated 1 million years. A few hedged somewhere between 2 and 1 million years ago, until proven otherwise. It was essentially anatomy-based dating. This looks primitive. Therefore, it must be old. The Rising Star team knew that wasn't good enough. If were going to claim there might be deliberate body disposal or any kind of complex behavior, you need a real place in time. You need to know what else was walking the earth when these individuals were alive. That's where things got messy. Dating cave deposits is notoriously hard. In open-air sites, you can sometimes tie your fossil layer to volcanic ash above or below it. Ash you can date with radiometric methods like argon-argon or potassium-argon. No such luck in Naledi. No convenient ash. No clear stratigraphic sandwich with a datable top and bottom. Inside caves, geologists lean on other tools. Uranium-thorium dating of flowstones and stalagmites. Optically stimulated luminescence, OSL, on the sediment grains that bury the fossils. Sometimes even paleomagnetism if you have the right kind of deposits. Each method comes with caveats. In a system as complex and disturbed as Rising Star, the caveats multiply. The team ended up using a combination. They dated flowstones, thin sheets of calite that had formed over some of the fossil-bearing sediments using uranium-thorium. Those give you minimum ages. The flowstone can't be older than the bones it covers. They used OSL on the sediments themselves to estimate when quartz grains last saw sunlight, before being trapped in darkness. They looked at the teeth with electron spin resonance, another technique that can provide age estimates, but is sensitive to assumptions about radiation exposure through time. Then they cross-checked different labs, different subsamples, different approaches to modeling the data, and what came back was not one of those comfortably ancient numbers. The best supported age range for the Naledi Homo Naledi fossils was somewhere between about 335,000 and 241,000 years ago. Let that sink in. Not 2 million years, not 1 million, not even 500,000. We're talking about a species with a brain roughly a third the size of ours, living in southern Africa at a time when our own lineage was already well along the road toward anatomical modernity. A time when other parts of Africa were producing fossils with big brains, chins starting to emerge, faces and skull vaults that wouldn't look outrageously out of place in a modern crowd. This is what people mean when they talk about late survival for Homo. If those dates are right, and we'll talk about the if in a moment, then Naledi wasn't some archaic ghost from a far-back chapter. It was a contemporary, potentially living alongside early Homo sapiens, side by side with bi-grained cousins in a landscape that was far more crowded and diverse than the old march of Sedja progress diagrams ever suggested. The implications are uncomfortable for a simple story of human evolution. We've gotten used to the idea that big brains, complex technology, and advanced behaviors arrived together late, bundled neatly into our species. Before that, in the simplified picture, you have a muddle of earlier forms gradually increasing in brain size, tool sophistication, and social complexity. Naledi, dated to 1/4 to 1/3 of a million years ago, blows a hole in that neat gradient. Here is a creature with a brain the size of an orange, possibly navigating a treacherous cave system, repeatedly in total darkness to access a hidden chamber filled with conspecific remains. Here is a creature that may have been using fire underground in a period when elsewhere our bi-grained ancestors are starting to produce more standardized tools, perhaps symbolic objects, maybe even early art. If Naledi really belongs to this time slice, then brain size alone cannot be your shortcut for predicting behavior. The association between cranial capacity and things like planned body disposal, navigation in complex spaces, or sustained social traditions becomes a lot more complicated. It also changes how we think about the neighborhood. 300,000 years ago in Africa, you potentially have emerging or early Homo sapiens with large brains and increasingly modern skeletons. Other archaic Homo forms that don't fit neatly into our species, possibly including lineages that contributed to our ancestry but don't look exactly like us. And now, possibly Homo Naledi, smaller, anatomically mosaic, but occupying some of the same broad geography. This is not a single clean line from primitive to modern. It's a bush with weird branches persisting late, overlapping, and in some cases potentially interacting. So why isn't everyone simply accepting the 245,000 year range and moving on? Because those methods and those cave deposits are contentious. OSL can be thrown off if sediment grains were partially exposed to light at odd times, or if the cave has been reworked by later water flow. Uranium-thorium dates can be tricky if the calcite flowstones have complex growth histories, or if uranium has moved in or out of the system after formation. Teeth sitting in a cave environment for hundreds of thousands of years can experience changing radiation fields as sediments shift, affecting electron spin resonance calculations. Add to that, the physical reality rising star is a dynamic karst system. Passages open and close. Water finds new routes. Sediments slump. Want a simple layered cake, with each slice representing a clean, consecutive time block. Materials can be moved, disturbed, or redeposited, which makes tying a specific fossil to a specific datable layer an exercise in caution. Some researchers have questioned whether all the applied dates truly bracket the fossils themselves, or whether some of the dated materials might represent later episodes of calcite, growth, or sediment movement. Others argue that the overlap of multiple methods on roughly the same window gives reasonable confidence, even if the exact numbers may be refined. The honest position right now is this. The weight of published evidence supports a mid-Platoine age on the order of a few 100,000 years for Homo Naledi in Denaldi. But the details and even the possibility of somewhat older or younger components are still being debated, and future work could shift the window. What cannot be easily put back in the box is the basic realization that Na is not some Pliocene relic from 2.5 million years ago. It is by all serious accounts, so far, an unexpectedly recent player, and that's where the behavioral expectations slam into the wall. If Nald were 1.5 or 2 million years old, you could look at a deep, awkward chamber full of bones and lean heavily toward exotic natural processes, complex repeated entry in darkness. Maybe less likely symbolic or ritual behavior, probably off the table under most mainstream models. You'd expect a small-raned, early homograph creature to be limited to relatively simple foraging, and shelter use with anything like deliberate body disposal seen as wildly speculative. Shift that same pattern into the last 300,000 years, though, and the frame changes. Now you're in a world where hominins are clearly capable of long-distance planning, elaborate social networks, sophisticated technology, and at least some symbolic behavior. A world where Neanderthals in other regions may be burying their dead, where our own ancestors are on the verge of or already engaging in behaviors we'll to recognize as culturally rich. In that context, a small-brain hominin repeatedly accessing a remote cave chamber, potentially with fire and leaving bodies there over time, is not just an oddity. It's a direct challenge to the idea that complex mortuary behavior requires a large, modern, human brain. And this is the pivot. If Naled is recent, then whatever is happening in Dinaledi has to be evaluated against the behavioral ceiling of its neighbors. The question stops being, could any hominin do this 2 million years ago, and becomes, could this particular hominin, in a world already full of smart relatives, be doing something we've doined, previously reserved for big-brain species, before we can answer that we have to confront another piece of the puzzle, the cave itself, because all of these behavioral inferences rest on one key assumption that getting into and out of that chamber was as difficult for Nailed as it is for us. The next step is to look hard at the geometry of Rising Star, the possible ancient entrances, and whether any natural trap scenario can really explain how all those bodies ended up in that dark, hidden space. To understand why people get so worked up about deliberate disposal at Rising Star, you have to walk the route in your head, not the pretty 3D reconstruction, the physical reality. You start in a larger chamber system, then squeeze into a tight passage that drops steeply. There's a section called the Superman crawl, because if you're a modern adult, you pretty much have to go in with one arm raised over your head, like a comic book hero, just to fit. Then there's a vertical-ish chute, roughly 12 meters deep, that narrows in places to something like 20 centimeters across. Not a nice straight shaft with a clear base. An awkward, irregular tube where you have to feel your way, twist, commit your body weight without really seeing what your feet are landing on. Only after that do you reach the Denali chamber, the fossil room. Now, cave systems can change over time. Passages can widen, ceilings collapse, entrances open or close. So we have to hold this map lightly. The geometry we see now may not be exactly the geometry N dealt with, but even with every generous assumption, the route into Denality is not whoops, I took a wrong step and fell in. It's multiple consecutive obstacles, narrow crawls, tight turns, vertical drop, dark, disorienting. Yes, but also structured. You have to keep going in the same basic direction through a series of decisions where back out, the way I came, is always an option until you're pretty deep. This is why accident explanations have a hard time for a one-off. Maybe for a whole population over time it gets harder to picture. Still, let's give the accident models their best shot. First scenario, pure vertical trap. In this version, some earlier configuration of the cave has a more open entrance that leads more directly into the chute, maybe a skylight or a wider mouth, now filled or collapsed. Animals or homins wander in, get too close to the drop, and down they go. No way back up. They die on the chamber floor. What would we expect to see? We'd likely find evidence of impact trauma concentrated on particular bones, ankles, legs, pelvis, skulls, depending on how far they fell and what they hit. We might see bodies piling up more or less where they first landed, not distributed evenly across the chamber floor. We'd also probably expect a mix of species. If this is an open trap operating for a long time, anything moving across the landscape could fall in. Small antelope, larger mammals, carnivores, stray hominins, maybe even birds. What we actually see in Daldi is a very strong dominance of hominal, with only a smattering of other animal bones, and not obvious, consistent high-energy fall damage on the gnarled skeletons. Bodies and body parts appear to have been in various states of articulation and disarticulation, with some anatomical connections preserved. That doesn't scream vertical death chute in the classic sense. Second scenario, disorientation and entrapment. Imagine Naledi groups using parts of rising star as a shelter or transient refuge. One individual or a small party explores deeper than usual. They follow a passage, squeeze through a tight section, descend a bit farther, and suddenly they can't figure out the route back. Maybe their light source fails, if they had one. Maybe they didn't have reliable light at all. They wander, get trapped in a cul-de-sac like Denality, and eventually die. Could this happen once? Absolutely. Could it happen multiple times over thousands of years? Maybe. If that were the case, we might expect to find some evidence of short-term utilization of other parts of the system. Hearths, tool discard, food remains in more accessible chambers, a pattern where the deeper chamber holds the dead and more open spaces show signs of the living. We might also anticipate a spread of ages and sexes that reflects random sampling of whoever got unlucky, not just children falling in, not just elderly, but a cross-section. To be fair, dinner does have a range of ages represented, so that part isn't immediately contradictory. What complicates the repeated disorientation idea is the sheer difficulty of the route. If navigating in and out is hard, then the more times you survive that journey, the better your mental map of the cave becomes. You'd expect the first few generations to be at higher risk. Over time, those who learn to avoid the lethal cul-de-sacs pass that knowledge on. In a small, socially connected species, repeated identical fatal mistakes in the same hidden room start to look less like bad luck and more like some kind of pattern. Third scenario, flooding and transport. Caves can act as drains for surface water. Heavy rains can flush sediments, bones and carcasses through passages, depositing them in low points. Maybe Naledi individuals died outside or higher in the system, and periodic floods wash their remains down into Denal. If that's true, we'd expect to see signs of water sorting, bones oriented in consistent directions, size-based segregation, where lighter elements travel farther than heavy ones, abrasion on bone surfaces from being tumbled along. We'd likely see more mixed, jumbled sediments with clear markers of high energy flow, coarse gravels, scoured surfaces, stacked debris layers. Studies of the Denality sediments have so far suggested relatively low energy deposition. The bones do not look like they've been repeatedly rolled and smashed by violent floods. Many are fragile and still in situ. The chamber also sits in a part of the system that doesn't obviously line up with a simple water in, water out path that could be flushing large carcasses regularly. That doesn't mean water played no role. Moisture and minor flows certainly affected the sediments, but a classic flood chute explanation doesn't fit neatly with the current taphonomic picture. So where does that leave the accident family of models? They get one clear point in their favor. Accidents do happen. Caves are dangerous. Humans and other animals die in them all the time. Finding one or two individuals in a tricky chamber could easily be chalked up to misadventure, especially if the route was slightly different in the past. The problem is scaling that up to a whole assemblage. To get dozens of individuals from infants to older adults, you either need a trap that was operating frequently and indiscriminately pulling in whatever wandered by, or a social behavior that repeatedly brought members of the same species into the same hazardous space. If it's the first, we should see more taxonomic variety and more classic trap signatures. If it's the second, we're already talking about something more than random accident. We're talking about groups making a habit, whether intentional or not, of bringing their own kind into a perilous hidden chamber. That's where the two broad camps draw their lines. Supporters of accidental models would be looking for clear evidence of a former, more accessible entrance funneling movement toward denality, convincing impact or transport damage patterns on the bones, stronger signs of water-driven accumulation, or alternatively, indications that the assemblage actually represents a much smaller number of events than currently inferred. Those leaning toward deliberate deposition emphasize the dominance of a single hominin species, the lack of obvious large predators or heavy scavenging marks, the low energy, relatively undisturbed sedimentary context, the difficulty of explaining repeated entries by chance alone. Notice that both sides are in their own way trying to answer the same central question. How do bodies end up there repeatedly? Every new piece of evidence, microscopic sediment analysis, refitting bone fragments, mapping of microregraphy gets weighed against that question. Does it favor a world where Naledi individuals just kept blundering into a death chamber they didn't understand, or a world where, for reasons we're still groping for, that chamber became a destination. Before we jump to the burial word, though, we have to work through one more layer of ordinary explanations. Accidents are one class, predators and scavengers are another, and the story changes again if someone or something else was moving bodies around. If you find a cave full of bones and you're not allowed to blame gravity or floods alone, the next suspects are obvious. Something dragged them in. That's not a wild idea. Plenty of carnivores use caves as dens, larders, or just quiet places to eat, without being harassed. Hyenas, big cats, wolves, bears, each leaves a pretty recognizable calling card on the bones they chew. So, what do those signatures look like? In a classic carnivore den, you usually see a few things at once. First, heavy modification of bones. Long bones with their ends chewed off to get at the marrow. Spiral fractures from fresh bone being cracked open. Pitting, scoring, and shallow grooves where teeth scraped along the surface. Distinctive, nor marks on the edges of vertebrae, ribs, and pelvises. Second, concentration and selectivity. Predators don't necessarily haul whole bodies. They bring in the parts they care about. Limbs packed with meat, heads, sometimes just choice sections. You get odd anatomical ratios, lots of limb shafts, few fragile ribs, lots of juvenile animals if the predator targets young prey. Sometimes a mix of species that reflects whatever was on the menu. Third, chewing styles. Hyenas crush and pulverize, turning big bones into fragments and tooth-rescored chips. Cats tend to leave more intact elements, but heavily mark the ends. Each carnivore has a sort of taphonomic accent, and with enough material, you can usually tell who's been dining. Now, lay that template over Naledi. Researchers have looked carefully faunaring and tooth marks on the Homo Naledi bones. There are some marks, but not the dense everywhere-you-look pattern you'd expect from a long-term carnivore den. You don't see extensive destruction of joint surfaces or systematic cracking of long bones. Many fragile elements, tiny hand bones, foot bones, vertebrae are still there in substantial numbers. That doesn't mean no carnivore ever touched a body. A scavenger might have gotten into an exposed corpse higher up in the system, or a small carnivore might occasionally have made its way into the chamber, but the overall picture does not scream, this is where hyenas drag their kills for generations. What about drag patterns? If a big predator hauls a carcass, bones can erode along the way. You get polish, localized scratching, or distinctive orientation of elements along a path. In open environments, but you sometimes even see raking or furrow marks in sediment where a heavy body was pulled. Inside, rising star, with rock walls and narrow constrictions. Transporting a body would be even more brutal on the remains. You'd expect major disarticulation, scuffing and fragment trails along the access routes. Yet, the bones concentrated in Naledi are again not systematically eroded like that, and the chamber doesn't read as an obvious endpoint of repeated dragging events. More importantly, where are the predators themselves? Carnivore dens usually contain at least some remains of the species doing the eating. Teeth, bones, coprolites, the occasional individual that died at home. In Naledi, non-naily fauna are rare and scattered. There's no dominant predator species showing up over and over again. The assemblage is overwhelmingly Homoni. So while something dragged them in is a natural starting intuition, the detailed autonomy makes the carnivore den model an awkward fit. Maybe the transport wasn't teeth. Maybe it was water plus scavengers. We already walked through the big flood scenario, but what about lower energy movement? Bodies dying elsewhere in the cave, partially eaten or decomposed, then gradually shifted down slope or nudged by smaller trickles of water into a deeper pocket over time. Here, sediment becomes your detective toolkit. Water that moves bones, even gently, tends to sort things. Light, small elements get carried farther. Heavier parts lag behind. Bones may be oriented in preferred directions, lining up with flow. Surfaces can show abrasion from rolling against sand and gravel. You might finding upward sequences in the sediments, coarser material at the base of a layer, finer on top as pulses of water lose energy. The published work on Dini sediments consistently describes a low-energy environment. The matrix is dominated by fine clays and silts, with little evidence of strong bone moving currents. Many bones lie where they seem to have come to rest, with minimal subsequent shuffling. They aren't sorted by size in a way that screams hydraulic winnowing. There are minor water features localized in deposits, signs that moisture has percolated, evidence that over long timescales, small flows brought in sediment. But that is different from a system where carcasses are being regularly floated in from upstream. If bodies or body parts were being nudged into Denali by slow creeping processes, we'd still expect more disarticulation upstream, more fragments trapped in intermediate pockets, more of a gradient leading toward the chamber. Mapping of the broader system hasn't turned up a clear conveyor belt like that so far. Could we be missing past pathways? Sure, cave systems are complex. Passages can fill, unblock, or change character. The Rising Star team themselves acknowledge that we don't have a perfect cross-section of its entire history. But within the observable sampled sediments around the fossils, the signs point to relative stillness, not a gentle underground river rearranging skeletons. Then there's gravity without water. Even in dry caves, things slump, slide and fall. Silings crack and drop blocks. Sloping floors carry loose material downward, grain by grain, over centuries that can shift bones dramatically, even without a single dramatic event. Gravity-driven processes leave their own kind of pattern. You get talus cones of angular rock fragments at the base of slopes. You see clasped fabrics, where elongated stones line up with the direction of slow movement. Bones tend to accumulate in depressions or behind obstacles with orientations reflecting downhill bias. The Dini bones do show some influence of gravity. This isn't a perfectly frozen death tableau, but again, the movement seems local and limited. You don't see everything plastered against one downslope wall in a chaotic pile. You see dispersed remains, some partial anatomical associations interbedded with fine sediments rather than locked in landslide debris. If a major ceiling collapse had dumped bodies into the chamber from some higher cavity, you'd expect broken bones jumbled with big rock fragments, a clear event layer of angular rubble. That kind of dramatic one-off gravity catastrophe doesn't obviously show up in the stratigraphy. Put all this together and compare the usual suspects: carnivore dens, flood transport, gravity collapse, against what's claimed for Rising Star. The classic models predict heavy carnivore modification and a mixed species assemblage if a predator den, strong sorting, abrasion, and consistent flow directions if water was the main mover. Clear downhill concentration, with rubble and chaotic fractures if mass slumping or collapse did the job. The Denali record, as currently described, offers light to modest evidence of scavenging, but not a carnivore-dominated taphonomic signature. Low-energy sediments, fragile bones surviving in place, limited water sorting, some gravitational influence, but no single dramatic collapse horizon that explains everything in one go. This mismatch is exactly why Rising Star refuses to settle quietly into any standard box. If the Naledi bones looked like classic hyena leftovers, the story would be easy. If they look like flood trash, easy. If they were crushed under a single rockfall, easy. Instead, we're stuck with a stubborn combination, a deep, hard-to-reach chamber, an assemblage overwhelmingly composed of one hominin species and bones and sediments that don't bear the hallmarks of being dragged in by something else, or violently transported by water, or dumped wholesale by gravity. That doesn't prove deliberate human action, but it does make the alternatives work harder than usual, which is why, whether you like the idea or not, the conversation keeps circling back to a possibility that makes many paleoanthropologists uncomfortable. If the predators, the floods, and the rockfalls can't easily take the blame, maybe the only remaining agents capable of repeatedly moving homon bodies into that chamber were other homunad, and that's where the deliberate body disposal hypothesis steps onto the stage. So what are we actually talking about when people say Homo Naledi might have been disorganizing of their dead? This is where a lot of confusion starts because our brains instantly jump from putting bodies somewhere on purpose to somber funerals, flowers, and whispered prayers. Those are not the same thing. Think of it as a spectrum. On one end, you have simple avoidance behavior, getting a rotting body away from where everyone eats and sleeps. No beliefs about an afterlife required, just hygiene, smell, and maybe an instinctive discomfort with corpses. A group drags or carries a dead individual a short distance, drops them in a crack, a ditch, or a side cave, and leaves. No digging, no careful positioning, no offerings. That's intentional disposal, but it's purely practical. Move a bit further along the spectrum, and you get deliberate placement with some consistency. Bodies are put in particular locations, maybe in particular positions. The group seems to treat death in patterned ways, even if it's still mostly about managing the living rather than comforting the dead. Keep going, and you reach a ritual. Now you're adding symbolic behavior. Maybe bodies are oriented in specific directions. Maybe grave goods appear, stones, tools, bits of pigment, animal parts. Maybe there's evidence the body was manipulated after death in a culturally specific way. On the far end sits formal burial, as archaeologists usually mean it. A prepared space, often a dug pit or modified feature. Clear evidence that sediment was intentionally moved and then replaced. A body placed in a defined arrangement. Sometimes multiple objects added that don't make sense as random debris. It's not just away with a corpse. It's this individual is being laid to rest in a way that means something to us. When Bergerer and his colleagues talk about homon and deliberate body disposal, they are, at least in their more careful scientific writing, staking out a claim at the lower to middle end of that spectrum. The minimum version of their hypothesis is surprisingly modest. Multiple Homo Naledi bodies ended up in the denality chamber. They did so repeatedly over time, and they got there because other Homo Naledi put them there on purpose. Not buried with flowers and songs, not priests chanting at the mouth of the cave, just conspecifics, moving corpses over and over into a deep, hard-to-reach chamber, for reasons we can't fully reconstruct. Why propose that at all? Because when you strip away carnivores, major floods, and catastrophic collapses as the primary drivers, you're left with a stubborn pattern that needs explaining. A remote chamber, difficult to access, an assemblage dominated by one hominin species, low-energy sediments, fragile bones preserved, No clear evidence of bones being swept in en masse from somewhere else. If Naledi individuals were living up near the surface and occasionally falling in by accident, you'd expect a different geography of remains. Bodies clustered near vertical drops, clear conduits, more mixed species, more trauma consistent with big falls. If they were dying elsewhere in the cave system and gently sliding in, you'd expect intermediate accumulations and a trail of disarticulated parts. Instead, Homo Naledi shows up overwhelmingly in this one tight, dark pocket. You can see why some researchers looked at that and said, fine, if nature isn't doing the moving, maybe culture is. But even within that cultural bucket, you have to be precise. The minimum claim isn't that Homo Naledi had religion. It isn't that they feared ghosts or contemplated souls. It's that at least some group members took the trouble to move the dead beyond the immediate living space and into a specific context, repeatedly enough that the pattern shows up in the Quibi fossil record. That alone would be a big deal given their brain size. So what kind of evidence would we expect if bodies really were carried in by other Naledi? Start with patterning. If corpses are being transported and placed, you might see clusters of individuals that share similar orientations or positions relative to the cave features. You might see repeated use of particular microspots, corners, low hollows, edges of the chamber as deposition points. You'd also pay attention to anatomical associations. Transport is messy, especially through tight squeezes. A body may start out intact, but by the time it reaches the destination, joints are loosening, flesh is degrading, and parts can detach. If Naledi were carrying freshly dead bodies, you might find partial articulation of skeletons, vertebrae still in sequence, hand or foot bones clustered as a unit, segments of limbs that look like they were still wrapped in soft tissue when they came to rest. You wouldn't necessarily see perfect museum-quality skeletons, but you'd see more local coherence than you'd expect from bones randomly washed in from far away. Next, you'd look for negative evidence. If the bodies came in under their own power, walking, falling, crawling, you'd expect certain injuries or positional clues. Repeated headfirst falls tend to leave consistent trauma. Trying to escape a dangerous shaft leaves certain scatter patterns. The absence of those consistent accidental death signatures doesn't prove transport, but it nudges you toward it when combined with everything else. Then there's the cave access itself. The current route to the Naledi chamber is tight and awkward, even for a modern caver with a helmet. Moving a limp adult body through it repeatedly would be physically demanding and logistically complex. If that's what happened, you'd anticipate some degree of damage to bones along contact areas, a strong reason to think that route was used often enough for such behavior to be known and shared culturally, possibly use of light sources if the chamber was pitch dark at the time. Researchers have indeed reported limited abrasion, local damage, and potential soot or burning evidence elsewhere in the system, which feeds into later debates about fire and navigation. But it's crucial not to jump from "it would have been hard" to "therefore they absolutely must have" done it and had rituals around it. The deliberate disposal hypothesis is in its narrowest form a kind of bookkeeping move. Once you subtract the familiar non-human agents of transport, you're left with the hominins themselves as the last plausible movers. Bodies didn't teleport. Someone or something moved them. If natural processes in this specific cave geometry don't seem to fit well, then social behavior becomes the default explanatory bucket. That's what makes the idea compelling to some and deeply uncomfortable to others. because baked into that move is an unsettling implication. Homo Naledi, with a brain smaller than many modern apes, might have crossed a behavioral threshold we like to think is tied to big brains. Systematic treatment of the dead. This is exactly where precision in language matters. When a scientific paper says deliberate body disposal, it is at least in principle making a constrained claim. Intentional transport and deposition of corpses by members of the same species. When a headline says small-brained human buried their dead, it's usually smuggling in extra baggage, ritual, meaning grief, maybe religion, all the symbolic scaffolding we associate with human funerals. Those are not automatically included in the data. Could Homo Naledi have had some kind of proto-ritual behavior? Maybe the deliberate disposal hypothesis doesn't rule that out, but it also doesn't require it. You could move bodies for purely practical reasons, to reduce smell and scavenger attraction, to avoid disease risk, to keep predators from learning where your group sleeps, or simply because corpses make living spaces feel dangerous or polluted in a way even non-verbal animals might respond to. Chimpanzees sometimes carry dead infants for days. Elephants interact with bones and carcasses of their own kind. You don't need articulated theology to get non-random behavior around death. So when we talk about Homo Naledi and the Dalati chamber, the key is to separate three layers. What the physical evidence directly supports. What is a plausible behavioral inference from that evidence? And what is narrative garnish added? Because humans like stories about the first funeral right now. The narrow, deliberate disposal hypothesis sits in that middle category. The chamber doesn't look like a hyena's pantry, a flood's trash pile, or a rockfall's accident scene. That makes repeated, intentional deposition by nail themselves a plausible way to tie the loose ends together. But plausible is not the same as proven. The bones don't come with inscriptions saying, "We did this on purpose." The sediments don't spell out "no floods here." The claim stands or falls on patterns, probabilities, and how well alternative models can or can't account for the same data. And that's where the argument inside paleoanthropology really lives. Not over whether it's logically possible for Naledi to move bodies, but over whether the current evidence is strong enough to elevate that possibility into something approaching confidence. To get there, we need to be clear about what burial means in this context, and what level of behavior the Naledi record might actually reflect. Because if we're not careful, a modest proposal about body disposal can quietly mutate into a sweeping claim about religion, symbolism, and the birth of human-style mourning. So before we decide whether Homo Naledi buried their dead, we have to ask a more basic question. What in paleoanthropology even counts as a burial? If you ask an archaeologist, "Is this a burial?" you're not asking for vibes, you're asking for a checklist. Over the last century, working with Neanderthal sites, early Homo sapiens sites, and later prehistoric graves, researchers have built up a kind of informal standard for what counts as a real burial versus a body that just ended up somewhere. At the core of that standard are a few big criteria. First, the pit. For something to be called a burial in the strict sense, you're usually looking for a cut feature in the ground, a hole that did not exist naturally, that somebody dug, that then got filled back in. In open-air sites, this is often pretty clear. You strip off a layer of sediment, and you suddenly see an oval or rectangular shape with different color, texture, or compaction than the surrounding soil. The outline has sharpish edges, sometimes undercut walls. Inside that outline, the sediment is a bit looser, or contains backfill material like chunks of a surface layer that were thrown in on top of the body. Archaeologists spend a lot of time staring at subtle changes in dirt for exactly this reason. A burial pit is fundamentally a negative space that someone created and then erased. Second, the body position. In known hominin burials, the corpse is almost never just sprawled randomly. You see consistent, constrained positions, flexed on the side, extended on the back, limbs brought in close. The skeleton fits the size and shape of the pit, as if the grave was made to accommodate a particular body form. The orientation can show patterning too. Heads toward a certain direction, faces turned a particular way, similar postures repeated across individuals at the same site. That is really hard to get from random collapse or post-mortem movement alone. Third, the infill. If someone dug a pit, put a body in, and then shoveled sediment back on top, the stuff above the bones should look different from the original ground around the grave. You might see layers of backfill that reverse the original stratigraphy, mixed material, stones, cools, or artifacts that belong higher up move downward into the grave. A smoother, more homogeneous sediment mass over the body, rather than complex laminations you'd expect from slow, natural deposition. Sometimes you even get a void over the torso or head where flesh used to be now partially collapsed, with sediment slumping in from the sides. That slumping can itself create diagnostic patterns. And finally, the extras, grave goods, intentionally placed stones, pigments, cut marks, or body treatments that suggest preparation before deposition, disturbed edges where someone may have knelt or leaned while placing the corpse. You don't need all of these to support a burial diagnosis, but the more of them you have, and the more they cohere into a single story, the stronger the case. Now take that checklist and walk into a cave. Everything gets messier. Caves are dynamic systems. Sediment comes in from above through cracks and fissures. Water seeps, drips, and occasionally pours. Roof spalls fall, break, and get incorporated into the floor. People and animals trample, lie down, and dig shallow scrapes. All of that can create features that look at first glance a lot like small pits or special depressions. A rockfall can create a hollow where a body later comes to rest, producing a kind of ready-made grave shape. Soft sediment can sag into voids below, making a subsident structure that looks like a filled cut when you only see the top. Burrowing animals can create tunnels and chambers that later collapse and fill, producing weird lumps and boundaries in the sediment. And when flooding is low energy, slow, gentle, not a raging torrent, it can move fine sediment in and around a skeleton in a way that looks deceptively tidy. Bones end up supported by gradual infill. Joints relax in place, and you get a laid-out look, even if nobody ever dug a thing. So even before we get to homoi, there's a core tension, the criteria we like to use for identifying. Burials were mostly built on open-air and rock shelter sites, where pits cut into flat ground are divisible. Transplant those expectations directly into a cramped, active cave environment, and you begin asking for trouble. This is where the interpretive traps start to show up. One trap is circular reasoning. If you go into a site already convinced a group must have been burying their dead, you'll be tempted to treat any depression or disturbed patch of sediment under a skeleton as a deliberate grave. You see a slight basin in the floor where a body lies, and you think, a burial pit. Then, because you've labeled it a burial, you turn around and use the presence of that burial as evidence of symbolic behavior. Your conclusion becomes your premise. The opposite trap is just as bad. If you assume from the outset that a particular hominin couldn't really be engaging in burial because their brain is too small or because you don't like the implications, you'll dismiss every odd sediment feature as natural variation and every coherent body position as coincidence. In both cases, you're reading your expectations into ambiguous evidence, and ambiguity is the rule, not the exception, in cave sediments. Boundaries between units may be gradational rather than sharp. Colors can change due to moisture or mineral deposition, not human action. Small pits can be real, but formed by soft sediment sagging around a decaying body, not by deliberate digging beforehand. So, how do paleoanthropologists try to avoid these traps? At least in principle, they lean on three things: comparative cases, internal consistency, and burden of proof. Comparative cases means asking, how does this assemblage stack up against classic, widely accepted burials? Think of sites like Shanidar for Neanderthals, or Caps and School for early Homo sapiens. These places don't have a single fragile hint. They have multiple lines of evidence, converging, clear-cut features, repeated body positions, consistent orientations, sometimes grave goods or pigment, sometimes multiple individuals in related configurations. If your new site has equally strong signatures, it's easier to argue you're looking at the same basic behavior. If it's weaker or different, you have to be more cautious with your labels. Internal consistency is about patterning within the site itself. Do multiple bodies share similar contexts? Same kind of hollow, same sort of sediment over them, same portion of the chamber being used again and again? Or is every individual sitting in a one-off situation that could be explained by local quirks in the cave floor? A single interesting depression might be anything. 10 bodies placed in nearly identical micro-settings is a different story. Burden of proof is the big philosophical piece. In science, extraordinary claims are not just cool headlines. They are statements that contradict a lot of existing expectations, and so they demand unusually strong evidence. Claiming that a Middle Stone Age Homo sapiens group dug shallow graves at a campsite, that's important. But it doesn't clash much with what we already know from slightly later periods. Claiming that a small-raned, morphologically primitive hominin deep in a cave 200, 300,000 years ago was practicing behavior analogous to intentional burial that pushes against several working assumptions at once about brain size and symbolic thought, about the timing of mortuary practices, about the uniqueness of modern humans. That doesn't make it wrong. It means the bar for evidence goes up. You're expecting to show not just that natural processes are imperfect explanations, but that the specific signature you will matches closely and repeatedly the patterns we see in clear-cut burials elsewhere. So, where does Homo Naledi land on this spectrum right now? Firmly in the grey zone. The Daldi chamber does not present textbook open-air graves with crisp pit outlines and obvious backfill. Nobody is claiming that. What Berger's team has argued, especially in their more recent papers on supposed grave cuts and possible burial pits, is that there are localized depressions, basin-like features, and sediment contacts under some individuals that they interpret as deliberate modifications of the cave floor. Critics counter that these features could easily arise from natural processes in a cave environment, subsidence, soft sediment deformation as bodies decay, minor water movement, or even the way sediment slumps around existing irregularities in the bedrock. Supporters say, but look, The bodies keep ending up in this chamber, and some are in what look like coherent positions. Detractors say coherence and clustering can also come from low energy deposition and decay in perm place. Nobody disputes that the Naledi remains are concentrated and that the chamber is unusual. The fight is over how far up the burial spectrum you can legitimately push the interpretation. At the conservative end, you could say repeated deposition of bodies in a specific remote cave chamber. No clear signs of digging, no unambiguous grave goods, so call it intentional body disposal, not burial. At the ambitious end, you could say some individuals may have been placed in prepared depressions, covered and left, nudging the behavior closer to what we'd label early burial. Right now, the broader field is not lining up behind the strongest burial language. Many researchers are comfortable entertaining deliberate disposal as a working hypothesis. Far fewer are willing to declare on the available sediment evidence that Homo Naledi was Tahitian ladies definitely digging graves. And that's the controversial middle ground this whole debate sits on. The cave context makes natural processes look more burial-like than they really are. Our hunger for a dramatic story makes us lean towards symbolic interpretations. The need for rigor tells us to lean back in that tug-of-war. Homo Naledi becomes a test case for how we weigh evidence, how we define burial, and how ready we are to redraw the timeline of complex mortuary behavior. To move forward, we have to ask one more question about this shadowy chamber. Even if nailed weren't digging pits, how are they getting those bodies in there at all? That pulls us into the next layer of the puzzle: light, navigation, and the possibility that fire itself was part of the story. If you've ever been in a tourist cave when they switch the lights off, you already know the core issue. Human eyes do not adjust to absolute darkness. There is no wait, 10 minutes, and it gets better. Once you're far enough from the entrance that sunlight can't bounce its way in, you're done. You can wave your hand in front of your face and never see it. You can step off a ledge you didn't know was there. That's the world of the Denality chamber. The route described by the Rising Star team is not a gentle stroll underground. It's a sequence of tight squeezes, vertical drops, and angled crawls. At certain points, you're moving through spaces where even a modern caver with a helmet and headlamp has to plan every shift of their shoulders. Now, imagine doing that without light, no faint glow from outside, no moonlight, no accumulated night vision, nothing. This is why the debate about fire isn't a side issue. It's central. If Homo Naledi were repeatedly taking bodies deep into that system, they weren't just dealing with a hard climb. They were dealing with sensory deprivation. In the absence of light, you lose not only sight, but also most of your spatial cues. You can't see how far the ceiling is. You can't judge distances. You can't track other people's positions. So, one question sits at the center of the controversy. Did they have to be using artificial light to do this? And if so, do we have any trace of it? When archaeologists talk about fire in caves, they aren't looking for Instagram-worthy hearths. Most of the time, what survives is subtle. You get soot, microscopic or visible black films on stalactites, cave walls or ceilings, often forming streaks, patches, or thin crusts. Charcoal, tiny fragments of burned wood, sometimes in clusters or lenses within the sediment. Heat alteration, areas where rock has changed color or texture from repeated heating and cooling. Reening, cracking pot lid fragments that spooled off under thermal stress. If a group was regularly burning torches, maintaining small fires, or using simple lamps, some combination of these signatures can accumulate. In European caves, used by Neanderthals and later Homo sapiens, we see exactly that. Stalactites, with multiple layers of soot, higher up than any natural fire could reach. Ceilings blackened in corridors that have no natural light at all. Charcoal lenses in floor deposits that match known firewood species. Heated stone surfaces in predictable locations near walls, at junctions, at living areas. These aren't one-off flickers. They're long-term patterns of illumination and habitation. At Rising Star, Berger's team has reported several forms of potential fire evidence both in the Naledi chamber and elsewhere in the cave system. They've described soot residues on some surfaces. They've noted charcoal pieces in sediments, and what they interpret as localized burning areas, spots where sediment and rock appear discolored or thermally altered, sometimes impossible hearth-like arrangements. On that basis, they argue that Nadi were not only entering deep, dark spaces, but managing fire inside them, carrying flame, using it to see, maybe even tending small fires during cave visits. Critics are cautious. Some of the soot and blackening could be from modern activity, explorers, film crews, even unconsciously brushing surfaces with gear. Charcoal fragments can move through cave systems via water or animal disturbance. A little thermal alteration can come from rare natural fires near cave mouths that send smoke and heat inward. To be convincing, fire evidence in a deep chamber needs context. You want blackened ceilings in places that humans would naturally carry torches. You want charcoal fragments that date to the same time frame as the Nadi bones, not recent decades. You want heat-altered rock features that don't sit right next to obvious modern impacts or access points. Some of this work is ongoing. Detailed micromorphology, thin sections of sediment under the microscope, can distinguish in situ burning from charcoal washed in later. Chemical and mineral changes can signal repeated heating. Careful stratigraphy can show whether charcoal layers line up with the Nadi horizons or lie above them. Right now, the situation is again in that gray zone. There are intriguing indications of fire use in the system. There are plausible arguments that artificial light would have been necessary to navigate to the Naledi chamber. But the direct, unambiguous, this cannot be anything else, signature of Naledi made fire inside. That specific chamber is still under debate. And even if we assume they had some sort of light, fire is not the only theoretical option. People sometimes ask, could they have used bioluminescent fungi, glowing insects, phosphorescent minerals? Could the cave have had some faint natural light source we're not accounting for? Bioluminescence is real. There are fungi, beetles, worms, and other organisms that emit a dim glow, but it's extremely faint. Enough to notice if your eyes are adapted and you're otherwise still. Not enough to safely navigate a twisting, vertical, hazard-filled passage. And there's no evidence that such organisms were present in useful densities inside Rising Star at the relevant time. Phosphorescent or reflective minerals can catch and scatter existing light, but they can't create it. Once you're past the zone where sunlight penetrates, shiny rocks don't help. Could they have mapped the route purely by touch? In principle, a person who memorized every twist, ledge, and crack could move through in total darkness, hand over hand, foot by foot. Cavers have experimented with this, doing known routes blindfolded. It's doable on short segments. Over longer, complex routes, error rates skyrocket. One misstep becomes a broken limb or a fall. Now apply that to repeated visits with a corpse. If Naledi were making their way into the chamber, guided only by touch, they would have needed extremely detailed kinesthetic memory practiced over many trips. They would also have needed redundancy. Multiple individuals who knew the path. So the practice didn't vanish if one specialist died. That's not impossible. It's just an extreme demand to place on a small-raned hominin if you'd also arguing they had no artificial light at all. And we hit another archaeological problem. Alternative light sources are hard to see in the record unless they involve combustion, a Rayner's torch, or a bundle of burning grass leaves, soot, and charcoal. A fat lamp made from bone and plant wick leaves residues. But if you imagine, say, glowing beetles in a woven container, or eyes adapted to marginally lower light near the entrance, none of that fossilizes nicely, which means our ability to test creative lighting solutions is limited. Fire is visible in the sediments. Most other options are nearly invisible. So we end up somewhat biased towards scenarios that involve combustion, simply because that's what leaves a trail we can follow. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that Nedi did use fire or some kind of light to reach the chamber. What does that tell us? For one, it implies root knowledge. Somebody had to learn and then remember a complex three-dimensional path from the surface to a hidden interior chamber and back. Not just once, but often enough for the behavior to become a tradition, because the Deneni chamber isn't a one-skeleton fluke. It has remains from multiple individuals, probably deposited over time. That means you don't just have a path, you have a mental map. You know that after the narrow squeeze comes the drop. After the drop, the angled crawl. After the crawl, the short stand-up section. You know where it's safe to step and where it isn't. You may even have named segments, landmarks, in whatever proto-language Na used. Second, it implies planning. You don't accidentally end up in that chamber with a dead body multiple times. You decide at the surface or near the entrance, we are taking this individual there. You gather whoever is going to help. If fire is involved, you gather fuel, dry wood, resin, maybe plant material that burns steadily enough for the trip. You schedule the task. Maybe you wait for a particular season when the cave is drier. Maybe you coordinate with others to watch children or guard the camp while the disposal party is gone. Third, it implies social coordination. Nobody is single-handedly dragging a limp adult carcass through vertical squeezes in the peas, dark, even with a torch. This is group work. Someone leads, someone follows, someone manages the body at each obstacle. The group has to move in sync, communicate, pause, and restart in unison. If the visits happened across generations, knowledge had to be transmitted. You don't learn this route by instinct. Older individuals who knew the passages would have to show younger ones step by step how to navigate. That is teaching behavior, demonstrations, corrections, guidance in a high-risk context. Here again, the evidence is suggestive rather than definitive. We don't have a fossilized Naledi flash mob caught in the act, torch in hand. We have an assemblage of bones in a deep, dark chamber, a challenging route, some contested traces of burning, and a set of reasonable inferences about what it would take to put those pieces together. On one side, you can say the practical demands are so intense that some combination of artificial, light route memory planning and cooperation is the most plausible explanation. Fire use becomes the simplest way to satisfy the constraints. On the other side, you can argue the fire traces are ambiguous. The cave morphology may have shifted over time, and we should be wary of projecting modern caving assumptions onto a system that might once have been slightly different. Both positions keep circling the same tension. The deeper you push the Nadi story into the realm of deliberate, repeated, Litby fire visits, the more you are implicitly crediting them with cognitive and social capacities that start to sound uncomfortably modern, the more you retreat to maybe it wasn't that dark. Maybe they didn't go in as often. Maybe light wasn't needed. The more strain you put on the basic physics of caves and the logistics of body movement. So, just like with burial, the safest thing to say right now is this: Homo Naledi was using that chamber in a way that almost certainly required some form of navigation skill and route knowledge, very likely involved group coordination, and quite plausibly depended on artificial light, probably fire, but likely and plausibly are not proven. To sharpen the picture, we have to look even closer at the microscopic clues in the sediments and on the bones themselves. Because if Nadi were visiting this chamber again and again, carrying flame, bodies and tools, they might have left a more intimate record of their actions than soot on a ceiling. When archaeologists say they're reading the bones, they mean it almost literally. A bone is not just a lump of calcium, it's a notebook. Every surface change, every groove, every fracture is a line of text. The trick is learning which handwriting you're looking at. Start with cut marks. If you take a sharp stone edge and run it across fresh bone, it leaves a very specific kind of trace. Narrow V-shaped incision, usually with fine parallel striations at the bottom, where tiny irregularities on the tool bit into the surface. Under a microscope, those striations can show you the direction of the cut, sometimes even the motion of the hand. Different actions leave different patterns. Disarticulating a limb, separating the fur from the pelvis, for example, tends to put cup marks right where ligaments attach. Skinning leaves, marks around joints, fingers, the face. Defleshing, stripping meat, can leave long, shallow cuts along muscle attachments on Naledi bones. That kind of evidence would be explosive. Cut marks consistent with defleshing would suggest bodies were modified before deposition. Cuts around joints could hint at dismemberment, perhaps to make transport down the cave easier. A certain pattern might look more like mortuary ritual, another more like butchery. Now add scraping. Scraping is different from cutting. Instead of slicing, you drag a sharp edge across the surface at a low angle. That can remove soft tissue, but it can also deliberately alter the bone itself. Remove periosteum, smooth a surface, perhaps even shape a piece for use as a tool. Microscopically, scraping leaves broader, flatter striations, often overlapping. The edge of the groove can be rounded rather than sharp. If you see repeated scraping in the same direction on a particular bone region, that starts to look like intentional modification, not random damage. Then there's breakage. A fresh bone still full of collagen and moisture breaks differently from a dry, long, dead bone. Green bone fractures tend to produce spiral breaks, curved edges, and sometimes hinged flakes where part of the fragment is still attached. They behave almost like slightly flexible sticks. Dry bones, in contrast, snap with more jagged, blocky breaks, often radiating from impact points. If you find lots of long bones broken while fresh, that might suggest marrow extraction, someone cracking bones open intentionally to get at the nutrient-rich interior. If most fractures look dry and post-mortem, you might be dealing more with trampling, sediment pressure, or movement within the cave. Surface weathering adds another layer. Bones exposed on the surface under sun and wind go through a known sequence of cracking, flaking, and exfoliation. They develop characteristic patterns over time that let you estimate how long they were out in the open before burial. If the Naledi bones show very little weathering, that implies short exposure before they ended up in the chamber. If some are heavily weathered and others look almost pristine, you might be dealing with multiple episodes. bodies that lay outside for a while versus bodies placed quickly. All of these traces, cut marks, scraping, breakage, weathering, are the macro part. The micro story lives in the sediments. Microrography is basically doing archaeology with a microscope. You take a block of sediment from the cave floor, harden it, slice it into paper-thin sections, and study the layers at high magnification. What looks like a single uniform deposit to the naked eye can dissolve into dozens of tiny horizons. Thin lenses of ash, pulses of silt brought in by water, trampled surfaces where feet compacted the grains. In a chamber like Denoli, this matters a lot. If all the bones and all the sediment features belong to one continuous layer, you could argue for a relatively short, intense episode of use, maybe a catastrophic event, or a brief period when many individuals were placed there. If under the microscope you see alternating layers, bones, then clean sediment, then a bit of ash, then more bones that points to repeated visits separated by time, people or homins or processes coming back again and again, each leaving a thin trace. Microrography can also separate events that got smeared together later. Imagine a Naledi individual placed on the floor. Over time, fine sediment settles around the bones. Much later, a small collapse from the ceiling drops a bit of rock and dust. Later still, modern explorers disturb the surface to a casual look that might read as one messy deposit. Under the microscope, you can tease apart ancient fine sediment with tiny charcoal flecks, a distinct pulse of coarser material from the collapse, then very recent contamination with plastic fibers or pollen from modern plants. Now, here's where things get uncomfortable. We don't have a forest of dramatic cut marks on the Naledi bones. A few possible modifications have been reported. Some striations that resemble cut marks, some breakage patterns that could be green bone fractures. But the overall picture is not one of clearly butchered or heavily worked bodies. Some researchers take that as evidence against any kind of mortuary processing. No obvious defleshing, no clear dismemberment, no trophies or rearranged bones. Then maybe the bodies ended up there more naturally. But absence of evidence is slippery. There are lots of reasons you might not see tool marks even if tools were used. Stone edges can be very sharp and leave extremely fine traces that erode easily. Soft tissue can be removed in ways that mostly avoid contact with bone. Post-depositional processes, movement, chemical alteration, microbial activity can blur or erase shallow marks over hundreds of thousands of years. And crucially, Naledi might not have done much to the bodies at all. If they carried whole corpses into the chamber relatively soon after death and left them intact, you wouldn't expect a lot of cut marks. You'd expect articulated skeletons at first, then disarticulation over time as ligaments decayed and bones shifted. So few marks doesn't cleanly support either side. It doesn't prove they were hacked apart. It doesn't prove they weren't handled with tools. It sits in that same gray zone as the fire evidence. Tiny observations can swing the pendulum, though. A single, unequivocal cut mark on a nail rib in exactly the place where muscles attach could change arguments about where the tools ever touched the bodies. A clearly green fracture pattern on multiple long bones might tilt interpretations toward deliberate breakage while flesh was still on. On the sediment side, one microscopic ash lens, securely dated to the same window as the bones, embedded right beneath a cluster of remains, would strengthen the case for in-chamber fire use, associated with body deposition. Conversely, If micromorphology shows the bones resting on an old compacted surface, with no signs of trampling, no ash, and a slow, steady rain of calite and fine sediment above them that supports a quieter, less active chamber history. This is why methodological detail becomes battleground territory. One lab's definite cut mark is another lab's root etching from plant growth. One team's ash lens is another's dust from a distant wildfire washed in later. The criteria you use to define a mark, the comparative collections you rely on, the way you sample sediments, all of that shapes the story you tell. In the Naledi debate, you can almost predict the clash. Supporters of deliberate body disposal lean heavily on any micro-evidence that points to repeated, controlled human or hominin activity, clustered bones, subtle patterns in orientation, hints of burning, micro-ratographic separation between events. Skeptics push back at the level of method. Are the samples representative? Are the interpretations consistent with other caves? Could the same patterns emerge from slow natural accumulation and later disturbance? So, when you hear sweeping claims, there are no cut marks, therefore no ritual, or there's ash, therefore they used fire for burials, what's often underneath is a much more delicate technical conversation. What counts as a cut mark? How many layers make a separate event? How do you distinguish an intentional cluster from bones herded into a corner by water or gravity? In other words, the fight isn't only about the conclusion, burial or not, complex or simple. It's about the tools we use to get there. And that matters, because the next step in the story moves from bones and sediments to the people, arguing about them. To see why Homo Naledi has become such a flashpoint, you have to look at the scientific pushback itself. Who's criticizing the burial and disposal narrative? What they're actually saying, and how much of this controversy is about caution versus discomfort with what it would mean if a small-raned hominin really did all of this. When the first gnarly papers came out, the pushback started almost immediately, not because people thought the fossils were fake, not because anyone doubted that something genuinely strange was happening in that cave. The discomfort was about the jump from, we have a weird, dense cluster of hominin bones in a hard-to-reach chamber, to these small-raned hominins were deliberately disposing of their dead, maybe even burying them, possibly with fire and engravings on the walls. For a lot of researchers, the leap felt too far too fast. Start with the basic skeptical position. Most critics are not saying absolutely no way now disposed of their dead. What they're saying is more like, you haven't ruled out enough other explanations yet to make that your headline story. They point to three big areas of concern: the cave itself, the processes that move bones around, and the way the narrative has been presented. First, the cave. The rising star system is complicated. Multiple chambers, tight passages, vertical drops, potential alternative entrances that might have existed in the past. Skeptics argue that our picture of how the system looked 200,000, 300,000 years ago is still blurry. Rock can fracture, blocks can fall, passages can open and close, water levels can change. A route that seems impossible now might have been easier then, or vice versa. So when the burial disposal papers lean heavily on the extreme inaccessibility of the Naledi chamber as a core argument, essentially they had to bring bodies in intentionally because there's where burial's lands can see. Critics push back. How sure are we that this was the only way in? Have all potential paleo entrances been mapped and ruled out? Could there have been a shaft from above that later collapsed? Could animals or water have used routes that are now sealed? To the skeptics, resting so much of the story on a reconstruction of ancient cave architecture, feels risky. They want more surveying, more 3D modeling, more speleology, before we lock in no alternative routes as a premise. Then come the depositional processes. The Naledi team emphasizes the absence of certain usual suspects. No clear-cut marks from butchery, no marks from carnivores, no obvious signs of the bones being transported by flowing water, no big blocks that fell and crushed articulated skeletons in place. To them, that pattern supports deliberate placement. Skeptics look at the same absence and say, you're over-interpreting what no sign really means. On water, for example, they'll say, you don't need a raging underground river to move bones. Intermittent trickles, pulses of water carrying fine sediment, gradual slope, creep over thousands of years. Those can shift, remain surprisingly far. Subtle sorting by size or density can happen without dramatic channel features. The fact that we don't see classic water transport signatures doesn't mean low-energy episodic water action played no role on carnivores and scavengers. Skeptics note that different predators leave different traces, and some leave almost none on certain bones. A few careful bites on soft tissue, dragging a body into a cavity, then abandoning it as it decays, might leave little in the way of tooth marks, especially if surfaces are later altered chemically. They also highlight that bones can move and break without any animals or flowing water at all. Gravity can cause gradual slumping down, even mild slopes. Sediment compaction can tip bones upright. Micro-collapses from the cave ceiling can jostle everything multiple times. From this angle, the Naledi chamber looks like a place where a lot of low-energy processes have been acting for a very long time in a confined, irregular space that can generate patterns, clusters, alignments, articulation here and disarticulation there that mimic intentional placement. So when the burial disposal papers point to pattern deposition, skeptics ask, patterned relative to what? How does Naledi compare to other fossil-rich cave chambers that nobody is claiming as mortuary sites? Are we sure-wheeled, not just seeing what complex natural accumulation looks like in a very cramped, very protected setting? Underneath that is a more philosophical concern over interpretation. In paleoanthropology, you're almost always working with incomplete data. A fragment here, a layer there. It's tempting to connect the dots with bold stories. Critics of the nailed burial narrative feel that the team has been too quick to treat suggestive features as if they were conclusive. A surface that might be a pit becomes a grave. A patch of altered sediment that might have many causes becomes an intentionally dug feature. A soot-like deposit that could be natural becomes evidence of controlled fire used for mortuary rituals. They're not saying these interpretations are impossible. They're saying each step adds another layer of assumption, and the uncertainty compounds. This is where peer review and replication come in. Normally, the way this should work is slow and painful. You publish detailed descriptions and interpretations. Other labs scrutinize your photos, your thin sections, your measurements. Some of them visit the site. Some request samples. They apply their own criteria, their own comparative collections, their own methods. They might agree with parts of your story, disagree with others, and propose alternative models. Perhaps a mix of natural accumulation and occasional deliberate movement of bodies. Perhaps repeated accidental deaths in a trap-like setting. Perhaps something we haven't even thought of yet. Over time, as more independent teams poke at the evidence, a consensus, or at least a stable range of plausible models emerges with NAD. Critics argue that the interpretive train left the station before that process really played out. Some of the most dramatic claims about burial, engraving, and fire were unveiled in high-profile press conferences and preprints before they'd gone through full traditional peer review. The media, understandably hungry for a story, amplified the most attention-grabbing version. Tiny-rained cave humans buried their dead and lit fires in the darkness. Once that happens, something subtle but powerful kicks in. Tentative hypotheses get fossilized as facts in the public imagination. Journalists write follow-up pieces that start from the assumption that Naledi buried their dead, then ask what that says about consciousness, religion, or the soul. Documentary scripts talk about the first graves as if the matter were settled. Meanwhile, inside the field, people are still arguing about basic stratigraphy. Skeptics worry that this media momentum feeds back into the science. If your entire research program, your funding, your public identity are now attached to a headline like "Rewriting Human Evolution," it becomes harder psychologically and politically to dial the claims down later, to say, actually, maybe it was a bit messier than we thought. So part of the pushback is not just about the cave, it's about norms. How fast should we move from data to big claims? How do we balance excitement with caution when the implications touch on core ideas about what made us human? Are we letting the possibility of a blockbuster narrative shape which interpretations seem attractive? At the same time, it would be unfair to paint all critics as stodgy defenders of an old hierarchy, where big brains do all the interesting things. Many of them are perfectly open to the idea that Naledi or other small-raned hominins could have evolved surprisingly complex behaviors. They just want the bar of evidence to be as high as it would be for any other extraordinary claim. And here's the part that often gets lost in the noise. There is real agreement on some key points. Almost everyone accepts that the Den chamber is not a random fossil dump like many others. The sheer number of individuals, the dominance of Naledi to the exclusion of almost everything else, the lack of big animal carcasses dragged in and chewed up. That combination is unusual. Most researchers also agree that the bodies did not get there through a single, obvious, simple process. Wheeled, not looking at 20 people crushed by one rockfall or a single flood event or one carnivore den. Whatever happened involved time, repetition, and a peculiar relationship between these homins and this space. Where the camps diverge is in how far we can push that weirdness. Supporters of deliberate disposal say the simplest way to explain repeated bodies over time, in a remote chamber with little sign of gnawing or transport, is that Ned were putting them there on purpose. Skeptics respond, maybe, but given the stakes, rethinking the link between brain size and complex mortuary behavior, let's treat that as one hypothesis among several, not the default. In other words, the fight is not about whether NL was an ordinary cave species doing ordinary cave species things. Everyone agrees Rising Star is a genuine outlier. The argument is over what kind of outlier we're looking at. A spectacular window into unexpected symbolic behavior, or a spectacular example of how messy and deceptive cave deposits can be. And that distinction matters because it leads directly into the next question. If Naledi really were disposing of their dead intentionally, maybe even using fire to navigate and marking the walls, what does that do to our picture of mind, meaning, and culture in the human family. If we take the hypothesis seriously for a moment, if Homo really were repeatedly bringing their dead into this chamber, maybe even arranging bodies or digging shallow pits, then the first thing we have to confront is this. Our favorite shortcut for explaining complex behavior just broke. For more than a century, brain size has been the go-to explanation. Big symbolic behavior must be a big brain. Cave art, big brain. Personal ornaments, musical instruments, planned hunting, ritual burial, all neatly slotted into a story where increasing cranial capacity slowly turns up the dial on mental complexity. Naledi doesn't fit that script. Their brains were roughly a third the size of ours. Think chimpanzee range. Somewhat reorganized, yes, but still small. You do not look at an Naledi skull and think, ah yes, here is the architect of complex mortuary behavior deep underground. So if it turns out that they were in fact repeatedly disposing of bodies in a difficult, dark space, we have to shift the question from how big was their brain to what did they do with the brain they had, and how did their social world amplify it? Because one of the most important lessons from living animals is that behavior is not just a property of individual brains. It's a property of groups. Ant colonies build cities without a queen architect. Bees coordinate intricate dances without a central planner. Meerkats teach pups how to handle scorpions through stepwise practice. Not because any one meerkat has a human-style theory of education, but because social learning is baked into their way of life. Now imagine a small-raned hominin that lives in tight groups, relies heavily on cooperation, and passes on habits by imitation and practice. You don't need every individual to mentally simulate a philosophy of death in order to get repeated body disposal. You need a pattern. Someone at some point does something once. Maybe they drag a body away from the main sleeping area to avoid smell and predators. They find a side passage that's dark and quiet. The group follows. Younger individuals watch. The act gets repeated the next time someone dies. Not because they held a council and formally agreed honorary protocol, but because that's just what you do with a body. Over time, that repeated act becomes a tradition, a group memory. In that light, Nald in the rising star system might not be evidence of tiny brains doing modern human religion. They'd be evidence that when you combine modest cognitive abilities with heavy social, learning, and strong group cohesion, you can get surprisingly stable, repeatable behaviors that look ritual-like from the outside. Notice what this does to the word ritual. In everyday language, we load ritual with symbolism, beliefs about souls, afterlives, gods. But anthropologists also use ritual in a more basic way, a repeated formalized behavior that carries social meaning. Even if the participants can't verbalize an abstract theology, chimps have proto-rituals. They perform rain dances of sorts, excited, stereotyped at displays during storms. They visit the dead, touch the body, sit nearby. Elephants return to bones, caress tusks, linger in ways that don't seem purely practical. Do they have fully developed symbolic systems? Probably not. Does that make their behavior meaningless? Also no. So if Niti were repeatedly taking their dead into a deep, dark chamber, maybe sometimes placing them in similar positions, maybe sometimes scraping a shallow depression first, we don't have to jump straight to religion to treat that as important. It could be a practical tradition. Keep rotting bodies away from the living. Use this consistently safe place where predators rarely go. It could be an emotional tradition. Death makes the group distressed. And doing this specific thing with the body calms them, unites them, helps them move on. It could be both pragmatic and emotional, braided together over generations in ways they never consciously analyzed. In other words, ritual without theology is absolutely on the table. If intentional, Rising Star would show that you don't need a modern human level of symbolic abstraction to generate something recognizably ritual-like. You just need repeated social practice, shared expectations, and enough memory to link this behavior with this kind of event across time. And once you admit that possibility, now stop being an isolated weird case and start sitting in a broader, messier record of early Morty behavior. Because Rising Star is not the only site where people have argued about intentional treatment of the dead. There's the Sema de los Osos in Spain, about 430,000 years old, with at least 28 individuals, likely early Neanderthals, piled in a deep pit at the bottom of a vertical shaft. Some researchers argue bodies were deliberately dropped in. Others say they washed in over time or accumulated in more complicated ways. There are the Laferasi and Schneideran Neanderthal skeletons, where some archaeologists see clear grave cuts and body positioning, maybe even flowers or offerings. Others argue that natural sedimentation and later disturbance can mimic those patterns. There are Middle Stone Age sites in Africa where hominin remains appear in unusual contexts. Crania cached in particular spots, bones interlaid with ochre or artifacts in ways that invite but don't quite clinch, an interpretation of deliberate treatment. Each of these cases is contested. Each sits in a grey zone between obviously natural and obviously a formal burial, and each time the debate is shaped by what we expect a given species to be capable of. For Neanderthals, we've slowly inched toward giving them more credit. Yes, maybe they buried some of their dead. Yes, maybe they used pigments. Yes, maybe some of their objects had symbolic value. Evidence accumulated. Preconceptions shifted. With Nalad, the starting point is more extreme because their brains are so much smaller and their anatomy so archaic in some respects. If they are doing any kind of repeated non-acal body disposal that changes the baseline assumptions, not just the footnotes, it would make a few big ideas suddenly more plausible. First, that complex social behaviors like structured responses to death can emerge in multiple hominin lineages independently, not just in our own, and not just once brains cross some magical volume threshold. Second, that the roots of caring for the dead reach deeper in time and spread wider across the hominin family tree than we've been comfortable assuming. Care might not start with grave goods and carved figurines. It might start with something as minimal as, don't leave the body where we sleep. Take it to that special place. Third, that we may have been underestimating the cognitive potential of small-raned hominins. More generally, if Naledi could maintain a tradition that required navigating a hazardous cave system, coordinating group action during emotionally charged events, and reusing a specific hidden location over many generations, then things like long-term memory for places, social conformity, maybe even a rudimentary sense of this is how our group does things, were likely in play. And finally, that culture itself, patterns of learned behavior transmitted socially, might be far less tightly linked to brain size than we've assumed. You can imagine Naledi bands teaching their young the path, the etiquette around a dead group member, the right way to behave in that chamber in the same way. that human families teach kids how to behave at a funeral today. The scale and symbolism are different. The underlying mechanism, social learning attached to emotionally salient events, is surprisingly similar. None of this is proven. It all hangs on that initial if. If these bodies really were brought here on purpose repeatedly, if the patterns we see are not just the long-term chaos of a tricky cave, if the engravings and fire traces in the system genuinely tie back to gnarled behavior rather than later visitors or natural processes. But that conditional is precisely why the stakes feel so high. On one side of the fork, a rising star becomes a cautionary tale about how easy it is to overread caves. On the other side, it becomes our clearest window into a form of mind that's not quite human, not quite animal, yet capable of something that looks a lot like tradition, like care, maybe even the earliest glimmer of ritual. And if that second path turns out to be right, then nailed they aren't just an odd footnote in our story. They become a test case for a much bigger question. Just how many different kinds of humans were doing complicated, meaningful things at the same time in the same world? To answer that, we have to zoom out from this one cave and look at the world Our Lady were living in, if the younger dates are right. Because here's the part that still scrambles people's brains, even more than crawling through a 20-centimeter gap in the dark. Homo, with their small brains and mix-and-match anatomy, were around at roughly the same time as us, not millions of years earlier, not as some distant ancestor we grew out of overlapping. The current best dates for rising star put Naledi between about 335,000 and 241,000 years ago. That's smack in the middle of a period when early Homo sapiens like fossils are already popping up in Africa. It's also not wildly distant from the time when Neanderthals and Denisovans are evolving their own distinctive forms in Eurasia. In other words, the late Middle Pleistocene and then the late Pleistocene weren't a clean relay race where one species passes the baton to the next. They were crowded. If you'd had a time machine and dropped into the right region of Africa 250,000 years ago, you might have found within a few thousand kilometers early Homo sapiens with relatively modern faces and brains, more archaic African lineages that don't fall neatly into our species. And if the rising star dates reflect their broader survival, Homo Naledi, short, small-reined, with curved fingers, and a chest shape that would look more at home 1,000,000 years earlier, all existing within the same general window of time. This is where our usual mental picture of evolution really starts to break. Most of us were quietly taught a march of progress model, even if nobody said it out loud. The famous illustration, ape, slightly more upright ape, caveman, modern human with a briefcase. One species replaces another, step by step, like upgrading your phone every few years. Nettle shreds that because their story, as far as we can tell, isn't primitive ancestor slowly upgrading into us. It's offshoot branch that splits earlier and then just keeps going. They look like a lineage that diverged from the main Homo maybe 2 million years ago, evolved its own distinct package of traits, and then quietly persisted in some ecological and geographic niches long after our part of the family tree was transforming into something recognizably human. So you don't get a tidy ladder with Naledi on the lower rung and us higher up. You get a bush, a tangle, a bunch of branches, some thick, some thin, some ending early, some overlapping for ages. And that bushy picture makes Rising Star way more interesting because if small-brained Nail are potentially doing complex, perhaps even ritual-like things, with their dead, at a time when larger Homo are also on the scene, that forces a difficult question. What do we actually mean by advanced? We like to equate advanced with more like us right now. Bigger brains, taller bodies, lighter skeletons, flattish faces, maybe a bit of jewelry and some art if we're being picky. By that metric, Naledi are supposed to sit near the primitive end of the human spectrum. Their bodies look halfway between much earlier Homo and something more modern. Their brains are small. Their technology, at least so far, seems to lack the flashy stone tools we see in later Homo sapiens sites. But if they really were navigating labyrinthine caves, maybe using fire down there, and repeatedly disposing of bodies in a consistent way, then suddenly advanced can't just mean has the biggest cranial volume in the room. It has to include, can you maintain long-term traditions? Can you coordinate as a group in hazardous spaces? Can you carve out a stable niche in a landscape already full of other hominicins? By those metrics, NAD look less like a leftover mistake and more like a successful specialist. Think about ecology for a minute, not just bones. Modern ecosystems are full of closely related species that avoid wiping each other out by occupying slightly different roles. Wolves, coyotes, and jackals aren't lined up in a rank order of primitive to advanced. They're just tuned to different prey, different habitats, different risk-reward strategies. So ask, what ecological slot could a small-bodied cave, comfortable hominin fill in a world where larger-bodied humans are spreading? A few possibilities show up immediately. Smaller bodies mean lower daily energy needs. An early adult would need fewer calories per day than a big-framed Neanderthal or a tall Homo sapiens. In marginal environments, patchy food, seasonal droughts, that can be a huge advantage. You can survive on less, travel farther between meals, and exploit resources that aren't quite enough to support a heavier cousin species. Their anatomy suggests they were good climbers with shoulders and hands that would make scrambling and vertical movement easier than it is for us. Combine that with apparent cave familiarity, and you've got a creature that might have been comfortable in broken, rocky terrain, cliff systems, and subterranean refuges that larger, less agile hominins avoided. That's a niche. Maybe Naledi weren't competing head-to-head with every other hominin for the same open savanna game. Maybe they were specializing smaller prey, different plant foods, different sleeping sites, different daily routes across the landscape. If caves played a big role in their life, shelter, storage, maybe body disposal zones, then they might have weathered climatic swings and predator pressure differently, using the underground not just as an occasional emergency hiding spot, but as a consistent part of their strategy. In that frame, their persistence into the late Pleistocene isn't baffling at all. It's what you'd expect from a lineage that found a workable script and then stuck to it. And that's where the public narrative often lags a generation behind the science. We still talk about the missing link as if there was one. We still tell a story where species line up in single file. Australopithecus becomes early Homo, becomes erectus, becomes H. heidelbergensis, becomes Hydanis, becomes Neanderthal or sapiens. Each step better, smarter, more human than the one before. But the more fossils, genomes and sites we discover, the more that story collapses. We've got tiny-bodied Homo pensis, hobbits in Indonesia, surviving until maybe 50,000 years ago. We've got Homo lucensis in the Philippines, another small, bolded, puzzling mix of traits also hanging on late. We've got Denisovans leaving their genetic fingerprints all over Asia and Oceania, despite almost no fossil record. We've got Neanderthals who made jewelry, used pigments, and probably had spoken language. And now we have Homo potentially doing specialized cave behaviors 250,000 years ago, with brains the size of oranges. This isn't a ladder where each rung replaces the last. It's a forest of branches. Homo sapiens is just one branch that happened to explode recently. Naledi is another that seems to have budded early and then maintained itself in quiet side pockets for a long time. Understanding that change is what coexistence means. It doesn't have to mean constant warfare or permanent subordination with primitive species, huddling fearfully in caves while advanced humans conquer the savannah. It can mean patchwork, regions where different hominins rarely meet because they're using different habitats, periods where ranges overlap and there's weary avoidance, occasional encounters that end in violence or trade or interbreeding, or all three at different times. From that vantage point, nailed isn't an embarrassment to human evolution. They're a reminder that for most of our deep history, there was no single way to be human. There were multiple experiments running at once. Some experiments leaned into brain size and symbolic complexity. Some leaned into raw physical robustness in brutal climates. Some, like Naledi, may have leaned into small size, agility, and a tight integration with risky but protective environments like caves. And if that's the world we're looking at, a world with multiple hominins, each with their own strengths overlapping in time and sometimes in space, then Rising Star stops being a bizarre outlier and becomes part of a much bigger question. What kinds of minds and cultures were walking the earth alongside each other? And how far down the tree do things like tradition, care, and maybe even simple ritual really go? That's where we're headed next. Because before we can decide what homonality means, we have to do one more uncomfortable thing. Strip away the wishful thinking, the headlines, and the horror movie framing, and ask what we can honestly say right now, and what has to stay in the realm of possibility, not conclusion. So, let's do that. Let's put the storytelling on pause for a minute. Take a breath and separate what's on solid ground from what's still hanging out on the ledge. Start with the part almost nobody in the field is arguing about. There really was a small-bodied, small-brained hominin in South Africa with a weird mix of primitive and more modern traits. The fossils are real. The anatomy is real. The dates for the Rising Star material, while they've been refined and debated, are broadly supported. A few 100,000 years old, not 2 million, not 10,000. And there really is a remarkably dense concentration of nail bones in deep, difficult-to-access parts of that cave system. Those are the strong points. We have multiple individuals, multiple age classes, in more than one chamber. We don't see a lot of big predators' teeth marks. We don't see the full suite of signs you'd expect from a random surface accumulation washed in by water or dragged in piecemeal by carnivores, over and over. The cave layout as mapped doesn't scream, "Oops, we fell in" either. You're talking about tight squeezes, awkward vertical sections, and no obvious natural light in the final rooms. From that set of agreed-upon facts, most researchers will accept another cautious step. Whatever put those bodies there probably wasn't pure accident. People can argue about how narrow the squeezes really were, or how dark it would have been in ancient conditions, or whether kids might have gotten stuck. But the consistent pattern across multiple chambers and the lack of obvious catastrophic event signatures make it reasonable to foresight to say something about more naily behavior, or about the behavior of something interacting with them, is involved in getting those bodies that far in. That's the supported core. Then we hit the fault line. Did now do themselves deliberately bring their dead deep into the cave? That's where you move from widely accepted to intensely disputed. Lee Bergerer and his team argue that the simplest explanation is deliberate body disposal by Naledi. To them, repeated placement of bodies in hard-to-reach, resource-poor spaces looks intentional. They see possible dugout depressions, possible grav-like features, possible use of fire to navigate, and maybe even modify the cave environment. They lean into parallels with later hominin practices, especially Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens burials. Critics aren't convinced. They point out that death's concentration of bones in a weird place is not the same thing as ritual. They question whether the supposed pits and grave outlines are clearly artificial or just natural irregularities in the sediment. They argue the fire evidence is suggestive, but not yet definitive, for sustained controlled use deep in the system. And they remind everyone how easy it is to over-interpret patterns when you rhyme, looking for a specific story. Underneath all the emotion, the disagreement boils down to how much we're allowed to infer from a very complicated, very incomplete record. So, let's slice the problem one more way. There are at least 3 levels of claim on the table. Level 1. These bodies did not just accumulate there by chance. Some consistent process, behavioral or geological, selected those chambers. Level 2. Naledi themselves were the ones transporting bodies into those spaces repeatedly over time. Level 3. What they were doing rises to the level of burial or mortuary ritual in the way anthropologists usually use those words. Right now, Level 1 is on pretty firm footing. Level 2 is plausible but contested. Level 3 is frankly wide open. And that brings us to the language issue that keeps sneaking in. Burial sounds so straightforward. You dig a hole, you put a body in, maybe you add some grave goods, you cover it. Done. But in paleoanthropology, burial isn't just a description of a body under sediment. It's a claim about behavior, cognition, and often symbolism. You're saying someone intentionally created a feature, placed a body in a particular way, maybe revisited that place, maybe marked it. You're saying something about how the living understood the dead. Disposal is looser. It can mean anything from gently placing a body in a hidden space to dragging it somewhere out of the way because it smells and attracts carnivores. It can involve care or superstition or pure practical hygiene. And then there's the most honest category we have, the one nobody likes to put on a conference slide. Unknown. Unknown doesn't mean nothing interesting happened. It means the pattern we see today can be generated by multiple different behaviors, and we don't yet have enough independent lines of evidence to pick one confidently. So where does Naledi at Rising Star sit on that spectrum? Right now, the safest statement is something like Homo Naledi is associated with repeated deposition of bodies in deep cave spaces that are unlikely to have trapped large numbers of reefs, purely by accident. The specific motivations, cognitive underpinnings, and social meanings of that behavior are not yet clear. That's not as dramatic as they buried their dead with ritual. It's also not as dismissive as it's just a bone pile. It leaves room for prying the question open with more data instead of hammering it closed with one favored interpretation. And that's the part that often gets lost in the excitement. In a field like paleoanthropology, this kind of uncertainty isn't a bug. It's the default setting. You're trying to reconstruct behavior, emotion, and meaning from eroded bones and disturbed sediments in a cave. that's in Nand, those has been breathing and crumbling and flooding for hundreds of thousands of years. Of course, you're going to spend years in the we can't be sure yet zone. If anything, you should worry more when a complex question gets answered overnight, with total confidence. Our picture of Neanderthals changed exactly this way. First, they were stooped brutes. Then, they were half-step ancestors. Then, the burial sites accumulated, the jewelry, the pigments, the DNA evidence of interbreeding, the signs of care for injured individuals. Each new line of evidence didn't just add a detail, it forced a rewrite. Naledi is sitting right at the beginning of one of those rewrites. Which way it goes will depend on what we find next. So, what could actually move the needle? Clearer site features, for one. If future excavations turn up unmistakable repeated dug graves with clear edges and stratigraphy cut into older layers, filled may be cut again. That would make the burial argument far stronger. So would consistent body positions that look intentional rather than tumbled. Flexed limbs arranged the same way, heads oriented in a particular direction, bodies separated from general debris. More secure, fine-grained dating would help too. If we can tighten the window for specific deposits down to, say, a few thousand years instead of tens of thousands, we can start asking whether we're seeing a long-term tradition or a shorter, more localized behavior. Correlating different chambers precisely in time would tell us whether they were used simultaneously or in sequence. New chambers are another wild card. Rising star is not fully explored. If additional Nadi-bearing chambers turn up with different patterns, say a space that clearly looks like a trap with mixed foral remains, or a chamber with a single, carefully placed, individual, and obvious features around them, that contrast could sharpen our interpretation of the original rooms. Sometimes the clearest signal isn't in the famous site. It's in the weird side room nobody thought was important. Then there's residue and micro-evidence. More detailed analysis of soot, charcoal, burned bone, and mineral crystals could tell us whether fire was used briefly and sporadically or regularly and intensely. Mapping microscopic sediment structures might reveal where the surfaces were smoothed by repeated crawling, where the particular areas were kept cleaner, where the bodies decomposed in place or were disturbed later. Even better would be higher resolution context outside the cave, finding Naledi at surface sites, with tools with cut-marked animal bones, with any hint of constructed features, would let us compare ordinary life behavior to what we see in the deep cavities. If Naledi is routinely using fire, making specific kinds of tools, or building shelters elsewhere, that changes how we read whatever is happening underground. Until then, we're sitting with a partial view, and that's okay. Science, when it's healthy, is not a highlight reel of confident declarations. It's a long, messy negotiation between data, bias, imagination, and criticism. Naledi just happens to sit in a particularly sensitive spot where our stories about ourselves are on the line, so the volume is turned up. Before we move into the final stretch of this episode and talk about why this mystery matters, for how we think about being human, a quick note. If you like diving into this kind of deep time, mind-bending history, I've put together a book expanding on these themes: human bottlenecks, parallel species, the strange paths evolution takes. It's available at sleepytimehistory.com, and there's a discount running this week if you want to grab it while you're already in this headspace space. All right, back to NDI. What we can honestly say today is that Rising Star has given us one of the most provocative hominin records of the last few decades. It forces us to accept at minimum that a small-brained human cousin was doing something, repeatedly, with bodies in places that took effort to reach. It has not yet forced us to accept that they were performing ritual burials in the full symbolic sense that word carries when we apply it to Neanderthals or later Homo sapiens. Between ritual burial and meaningless accumulation, though there's a wide middle ground of behaviors, pragmatic disposal to avoid predators, protecting the living from disease, hiding vulnerable bodies from rival groups, or even in Kuwait, early forms of respect for the dead that don't leave the clears, kind of unambiguous traces we crave. The hard truth is that we may never be able to label Naledi's cave behavior with a single neat word. The fossils might always sit on that uncomfortable line where multiple stories remain possible. But even that liminal status is telling us something important. It's telling us that the boundary between animals who die and humans who remember might not be a sharp cliff, but a long sloping hillside with many stopping points along the way. Naledi could be standing somewhere on that slope, doing something that is neither fully ritual nor purely instinctive. In the final part of this video, we're going to lean into that idea, because whether or not Homo Naledi buried their dead in the way we want them to, the Rising Star caves are already forcing us to rethink two big assumptions: how unique our way of being human really is, and how early things like care, memory, and tradition might have started to take root in minds that were not quite like ours, but not as alien as we once thought. So, let's pull the whole thing together into one clean thread. We have a small-raned hominin, anatomically strange, but very much walking on two legs, living in South Africa a few 100,000 years ago. We have a cave system with deep, awkward, lightless chambers that are not casual. Oops, I tripped parts of the landscape, and in those chambers we have a lot of Naledi bodies. Infants, juveniles, adults, repeatedly present, not obviously dragged in by hyenas, not obviously washed in by some massive one-off flood. From there, the fork in the road isn't about the bones, it's about intent. Did these bodies end up there as an almost mechanical consequence of some behavior we barely understand? Occasional shelter-seeking gone wrong, rare accidents that accumulated over long timescales, interactions with other predators we haven't fully modeled? Or did Naledi repeatedly and intentionally move their dead into the deep, dark parts of that cave system for reasons that mattered to them? That's the core mystery. Everything else, fire or no fire, pits or no pits, burial versus deposition, is orbiting that question of intent. And what it would say about minds that were, according to our old story, supposed to be too small to think that way. And this is where it really helps to separate headlines from evidence. Headlines love sharp edges. Cave humans buried their dead like us. Ritual discovered, oldest grave. They also love sharp rebuttals. No evidence for burials. Overblown claims. Nothing to see here. The actual evidence lives in the middle. We have clear, repeatable facts about bones, sediments, chamber layouts, and dates. We have competing models that try to explain those facts with the least number of assumptions. We have a lot of ambiguity. The nuance, the place where people honestly disagree, where different archaeologists would put their money on different horses, that's the interesting part. That's where you see science doing its real work. So, if you had to walk away with a grounded, most plausible range today, it might sound something like this. At the low end, Naledi could be using the cave system in some way we don't fully understand, maybe as temporary refuge, maybe seasonally, and a mix of rare accidents, collapses, and complex cave dynamics, slowly concentrated bodies in particular chambers over long periods. In that scenario, Na isn't puri behavior so much as getting caught by a dangerous environment they didn't transme completely control. In the middle, Naledi could be deliberately moving bodies into deep, hard-to-access spaces, but for reasons that are more practical than symbolic, keeping decomposing corpses away from sleeping and food processing areas, reducing smells, flies, and predator attraction, maybe hiding vulnerable bodies from rival groups. This is disposal with intent, but not necessarily with ritual in the full modern human sense. At the high end, Naledi could be participating in the very early, very rough beginnings of what we'd recognize as mortuary tradition, not just dumping bodies, but consistently choosing specific spaces, perhaps returning to them over generations, perhaps treating the dead differently from other discarded materials. Symbolism and belief may have been present, but in forms that don't map neatly onto our later ideas of funeral, grave, or afterlife. All three of those are live options right now. None has a knockout punch behind it. What we don't have is strong support for the extremes. The idea that this is just a random bone jumble with nothing behaviorally interesting about it. Or the idea that Naledi was basically a small-raned Homo sapiens holding candle-like vigils underground. The sweet spot of plausibility is that something non-trivial was happening here, something that required effort, repeated action, and some kind of decision about what to do with the dead. But the exact mental world behind those decisions is still out of reach. And that's where the bigger theme kicks in. Human evolution is not a simple staircase of progress, with brains getting bigger and behavior suddenly flipping from animal to human one afternoon in Africa. It's messy, it's branching, it's full of side experiments and half-steps, and weird mosaics of traits. You get robust, bi-grained Neanderthals covering their dead and using pigments. You get Denis leaving almost no fossils but scattering their genes across half of Asia. You get Homo sapiens painting caves and building cities. And now maybe you get Homo Naledi, small-raned, anatomically odd, doing something with their dead in the dark that brushes against the edges of care, memory, and place. Whether Naledi ever crosses the line into true burial in our textbooks almost matters less than the fact that we're having to consider the possibility at all. Because the real shock of Rising Star is not a single claim about a single behavior. It's the way it stretches the range of minds that might have been capable of doing something recognizably uncomfortably human. And that story isn't finished. New excavations could sharpen the picture. New analysis could drag one of those plausible range options into clearer focus. Or we might find a completely different site somewhere else that forces everyone back to the drawing board again. For now, the mystery remains unresolved, and perhaps that is exactly where it should remain. If you followed this journey from the surface into the deepest passages of the cave, thank you for staying with me. These stories live in the space between physical evidence and the questions science has not yet answered. If you enjoy exploring that space, consider liking the video, sharing your thoughts in the comments, and subscribing for more journeys into humanity's distant past. Tell me where you are listening from. Share your country, your city, or even the setting around you right now as you imagine these Small ancient hominins navigating dangerous underground world hundreds of thousands of years ago. For those who want to explore these ideas further, you can visit sleepytimehistory.com. The book available there examines ancient population bottlenecks, multiple human species, lost evolutionary branches, and the many different forms humanity may once have taken. It places the Homo Naledi mystery within a much larger and more complicated story of human evolution. No matter where you are or how you discovered this story, keep one thing in mind. Our understanding of humanity is still incomplete. It continues to change with every fossil recovered, every discovery, and every strange, unanswered question brought back into the light.